I remember the exact moment the knock at the front door shattered the silence. Midnight had just chimed, and the only things I could hear until then were the soft drone of the wind and our collective breathing. Our makeshift lamp flickered in the old living room, creating dancing shadows on walls, warped by time. The air in that remote house outside Denver felt unnaturally still, as if the entire place was holding its breath. Then came that insistent rapping, a series of crisp, hollow strikes that sounded far too deliberate to be a random branch tapping in the breeze. My heart thumped so violently that it nearly drowned out the second wave of knocks. The old clock in the corner had stopped working decades ago, its dusty face frozen at some forgotten hour. We had come here on a dare, enticed by stories of odd vanishings and local whispers of unearthly sight. The plan was to stay overnight, gather footage for a project, and prove we could face down whatever lurked in these neglected rooms. But the moment that knock echoed through the corridor, it felt like the darkness took on a living quality, pushing in on us. I was the first to stand, my pulse hammering at my temples. The faint glow from our emergency lantern barely illuminated the hall, leaving corners masked in deep shadow. My two companions, equally spooked, stayed close behind me, every footstep on the warped floorboards sending a soft creak through the emptiness. The door was old, two heavy wooden panels dotted with chipped paint and rusted hinges that threatened to squeal if you so much as breathed on them. My hand trembled when I gripped the metal knob. It's tourist. I didn't understand why I was so afraid. We'd heard the legends of people going missing in this old house, but we'd dismissed them as tall tales. Yet the silence right then felt thicker, sharper, as though something waited on the other side for me to unlatch that door. Swallowing back a surge of dread, I twisted the knob and pulled. A chill wind swept in, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and rotten leaves. The porch lay empty, lit only by a half moon glimmering behind thin clouds. There wasn't a single footprint in the dust, nor any sign of another person. My breath clouded in the cold air as I leaned out, shining a small flashlight across the yard that sloped gently into a line of stunted trees. No movement, no sound. The sense of being watched intensified, though making the hairs on my neck prickle. I stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under my weight. The night air was crisp and so quiet that every shift in the floorboards felt magnified. Wind fluttered through the nearby pines, yet it did nothing to ease my feeling of unease. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. Nothing answered anyway, only my own heartbeat thrumming in my ears. Behind me, I heard a muffled exhale, and I realized my companions had followed, equally caught between terror and fascination. The porch wrapped around the side of the house, ending at a crooked gate that opened onto a gravel path. I found myself stepping toward it, searching for any sign of motion. The flashlight's beam cut across patches of tall grass, revealing slivers of broken fence. My gaze darted left and right, half expecting to catch a glimpse of someone crouching in the shadows. A sudden scrape against the porch's far corner made me jerk the beam of light in that direction. The noise halted instantly, leaving only the echo of my own startled breath. I advanced another step, the rotting planks shifting ominously beneath me, threatening to give way. When no second noise emerged, I retreated back inside, shutting the door with more force than necessary. My pulse still pounded, and I was sure my friends could see the panic in my eyes. Inside, the stale air felt stifling. Paint peeled along the walls, revealing older layers beneath, each tinted in a drab color or pattern from another era. An antique radio sat in one corner, silent for who knew how many decades, its knobs frozen in a layer of dust. Our lantern threw distorted shadows that flicked across the tattered wallpaper. We joked earlier that this living room seemed like a time capsule, stuck in mid-20th century gloom. But now, it felt more like a trap, somewhere we weren't meant to be. An uneasy hush descended, the only sound my labored breathing. Finally, I worked up the nerve to speak. My voice emerged, shaky, almost a whisper. The others nodded, their eyes shifting toward the boarded-up windows and the half-open doorway leading to the rest of the house. The plan, originally, was to set up a small camera in each main room to document any odd phenomena. But after that series of knocks, the thought of splitting up, even for a moment, seemed overwhelming. A faint scratching noise above us interrupted the tension. It came from the ceiling, a gentle rasping as if something was crawling in the attic. My breath caught, and I aimed my flashlight upward, scanning the water-stained ceiling. The scratches moved, creeping from one side to the other, but then abruptly stopped. The hush returned. Anxious, I paced near the fireplace, shining the flashlight around the mantel. Dust blanketed old picture frames. The images inside, too faded to make out. My foot kicked something small and solid, a porcelain figurine lying face down on the hearth. I picked it up, feeling a wave of unease as I realized half its face had been chipped away. The single painted eye stared at me with a strangely accusatory expression. Suddenly, a thought flashed unbidden. This place wanted me to find these things, to sense the tragedies hidden in its walls. A sharp metallic clang made me spin around, heart leaping to my throat. It came from the corridor that led to the back of the house, an area we hadn't yet explored. My companions and I instinctively huddled closer, the flashlight beams bouncing along the hall. The clang resounded again, hollow and strained, as though an iron door had slammed. Something about it felt deliberate, like a warning or an invitation. Drawing a steadying breath, I ventured further into the hallway, eyes flicking to the left, where a dilapidated staircase ascended to the second floor. The wooden steps appeared dangerously loose, each one blanketed in dust. A lone mirror on the wall reflected our lantern light, warped by age so that our silhouettes seemed oddly elongated. My pulse hammered louder, drowning out all other noise as I neared the end of the corridor. Down with shivers. A closed door stood slightly ajar on my right, warped from years of moisture. There, the air felt colder, almost clammy. The metallic clang from earlier had gone silent, replaced by a subtle drip, maybe water seeping through the roof. I pushed the door open with the toe of my shoe, half expecting something to leap out. The beam of my flashlight swept across a cramped utility room. Rusted tools hung from the walls, and an unpleasant smell, like wet cardboard mixed with rot, invaded my nostrils. The floor was littered with scraps of tattered cloth, and what looked like dried mud or soil, nothing obviously out of place. Yet the hair on my arms remained standing. I edged back into the hall, uncertain how to proceed. Then, from overhead, that scraping resumed. Closer this time. My companions shot me terrified glances. We realized it was coming from near the top of the staircase, as if whatever had made that noise was shifting its position. I swallowed hard. Part of me wanted to run out the front door and never look back. Yet, some morbid curiosity forced me onward. Step by cautious step, I approached the base of the stairs, shining my flashlight up toward the landing. The light revealed chipped spindles and a threadbare runner leading to the second floor. I couldn't see anything beyond the bend. An uneasy silence spread over us, like the house had exhaled, waiting for our next move. My breath hitched, and my foot touched the first step, which groaned under my weight. Another step, bite, then another. With each one, the boards announced our presence in loud creaks. Midway up, I paused, half convinced I heard the faintest whisper. My skin tingled. I aimed the beam around. Peeling wallpaper, dust-laden frames, a door at the end of the upstairs hallway, hanging open at a crooked angle. Nothing else. Nothing. Exchanging a look with my friends, I continued upward, heart pounding so loudly it echoed in my skull. At the top, I stood in a corridor, lit by the thin glow of the moon through a cracked window. A tangle of spiderwebs spanned the corners, drifting in the faint breeze. My flashlight skimmed the floor, picking out footprints in the dust. Footprints that couldn't have come from us, given they were too large and led toward a closed door on the right. My stomach knotted. Whoever, or whatever, had made those prints was nowhere to be seen. A faint scraping, like a soft drag of nails against wood, reverberated from behind that closed door. The handle looked ancient, half rusted away. I felt an almost magnetic pull, urging me closer. In my head, I screamed at myself to turn around. Yet my legs kept moving forward. Each step brought the faint smell of something bitter and stale, an odor that set my nerves on high alert. I extended my trembling fingers toward the doorknob, touched its cool metal surface, and felt a pulse of dread surge through me. With a slight push, the door inched open, revealing an almost pitch-black room. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating piles of disorganized furniture and boxes. The scraping noise died off instantly, replaced by an eerie hush. A battered window let in a thin shaft of moonlight, highlighting specks of dust dancing in the musty air. I stepped inside, my companions crowding behind me, their breathing ragged. The room felt off, like it was steeped in an old sorrow that clung to every object. My flashlight caught the shape of something in the corner, a wardrobe or cabinet draped in a stained sheet. I scanned the floor, noticing streak marks leading from the doorway to that covered object, as if it had been dragged across the room. My pulse thundered at the thought of what might be hidden underneath. Gathering every bit of courage I had left, I approached the draped cabinet. The fabric looked damp, with dark patches that made me queasy just to think about. Slowly, I latched onto the edge of the cloth, heart pounding so fiercely it reverberated through my entire body. This was the moment I realized where any lingering innocence would vanish. Whatever was behind that sheet felt like the key to every rumor and missing person report linked to this forsaken house. And somehow, I knew it would change me forever. Adieu, Sir Missal, to kind old way, and anew, to bow. With the stifled hush hanging in the air, I tugged the sheet aside, and a flutter of dust exploded around me. What I saw underneath seized my breath in my throat, leaving me paralyzed, trapped between the raw disbelief of the impossible and the soul-crushing certainty that I was now witnessing something no one should ever have to see. I forced my lungs to draw in air, while my heart thundered like a hammer. What I'd revealed behind the sheet was a large wooden cabinet, its surface scratched and warped, a thick chain wrapped around its handles, dug into the splintered wood and secured by an ancient padlock tarnished by rust. My mind reeled with possibilities. Why chain up a cabinet at all? And in such a crude way? A cold sensation, like I'd brushed up against something venomous, spread along my arms. My companions hovered behind me, their flashlight beams overlapping in anxious sweeps across the dusty floor. The oppressive sense of a silent audience pressed down on us, as though the entire house breathed around our every movement. The cabinet creaked softly, prompting my stomach to flip. It wasn't my imagination. I heard the faintest shift of something inside, like a low shuffle. The barest stirring that said we weren't alone. A pang of dread knotted in my chest. My mind whispered that I should run, leave that chain intact, pretend I never saw it. But I'd come too far, and the weight of that curiosity was now unstoppable. With a trembling hand, I tugged on the chain. It clinked against the padlock, refusing to yield. One of my friends murmured a question, but I only shook my head, uncertain how to respond. We were all transfixed by the possibility that this chain was the only barrier to something unspeakable. I stepped back, noticing a cracked crowbar propped against the wall amid a tangle of other random items. An overturned stool stacks of yellowed newspapers, a broken mirror frame. My flashlight glinted off the crowbar's metal edge, suggesting it could pry open the lock if we dared. Each second I stood there, I felt a surge of panic that this house was tightening its grip on us. Whatever existed in that cabinet demanded attention, yet every bone in my body screamed that forcing it open would be a terrible mistake. Despite the warnings pounding in my brain, I reached for the crowbar. The handle felt gritty with layers of dust and what might have been flecks of rust. My legs wobbled while I wedged the metal tip against the lock, pushing with slow pressure until the chain groaned. A spike of adrenaline shot through me. For an instant, the chain held. Then, with a sudden jolt, the padlock snapped at a weak point, and the chain clattered to the floor. All three of us jumped, hearts pounding in unison. The cabinet doors rattled, swinging inward a crack, even in the glow of our flashlights. I couldn't see much. A stale odor wafted out. Something damp and musty, tinged by a metallic edge that pricked at the back of my throat. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting some monstrous figure to appear at the doorway. The corridor remained vacant, though, silent, except for the roar of my pulse in my ears. Fighting nausea, I inched closer, nudging the cabinet door open the rest of the way with the crowbar. My mind raced with images from every horror tale I'd ever heard. Blood-stained secrets, contorted shapes that should never be alive. The interior was cloaked in shadow, so I raised my flashlight. What I saw made me recoil instantly. A tangle of worn cloth that seemed to be wrapped around something. At first, I thought it might be old rags or bedding. But then it shifted ever so slightly. A shaky breath escaped my lips. The shape was far too large to be an animal's nest. My flashlight revealed a hint of pale skin beneath the shredded fabric. That's when a low sound emerged, like the hush of a pained exhale. Ice flooded my veins. I realized there was someone inside, huddled and bound. I stepped back, heart hammering, unsure if they were alive or gone. My companions crowded in, their beams converging on the figure. For a moment, none of us moved. My mind spun in circles, struggling to process this. Who was it? Why chain them here? An overwhelming mixture of horror and pity welled up in my chest. I couldn't stand the idea that we might be confronting a victim of something worse than any ghost story. The shape's breathing sounded ragged, uneven, and too faint. I reached out with a trembling hand, tugging gently at the cloth. In the flash of the beam, I saw a portion of a face, sunken cheeks, parted lips, an eye sealed shut by swelling or scarring. My stomach twisted. If they were alive, how had they survived? My friend's voice trembled, though I barely registered the actual words. We had no phone signal, no certain help. We had no phone signal, but leaving this person here was unthinkable. Bracing myself, I tried to unwind the ropes, lashing them in place. The knots were caked with grime. I fought back panic, focusing on each loop of the cord. Every time I tugged, the figure whimpered, as if even slight movement was agony. Eventually, the ropes gave a little, and I managed to peel away more of the stained cloth. A sticky residue clung to my fingers. I refused to analyze it too deeply. Once the face was more fully visible, I recoiled. Swollen bruises, old cuts, and something that looked like a crudely carved symbol marred the forehead. I forced down the bile rising in my throat, feeling my heart pound painfully. This was real. Someone had done this. Faintly, the person's one good eye fluttered. Their lips quivered, possibly trying to form words, but failing. My flashlight flickered, amplifying my sense of claustrophobia. If we didn't do something now, I couldn't imagine this person lasting much longer. Summoning courage, I tore off the last restraints. My palms slick with sweat. A shuddering cough escaped their throat. Then a weak groan of pain. My friend fumbled for water, though he had nothing but an empty bottle and trembling hands. In the corridor, a sudden thump broke our frantic focus, as if a door slammed shut. The house felt like it shifted around us, flexing. My heart lurched at the thought we weren't alone up here. Balancing the flashlight between my chin and shoulder, I tried to lift the injured individual. Their body was limp, dead weight, and I was nowhere near strong enough on my own. My companions rushed in to help, but fear sapped our strength. We stumbled, half dragging this person from the cabinet, nearly tripping over the fallen chains. The house groaned audibly, a disquieting moan that reverberated through the walls, making the floor quiver under our feet. Every breath felt like breathing underwater. We managed to move the unconscious figure across the room, away from that wretched cabinet. Another thump echoed in the hallway. My nerves screamed to get out, to get this poor soul to safety. But how and where? The front door lay down the stairs, across that long hallway, through the living room that felt so empty yet so fraught with potential horrors. And we had no clue what else might lurk in the shadows, drawn by the noise. With adrenaline spurring us on, we shifted the person's weight between us, stumbling toward the door to the corridor. The boards underfoot emitted a series of groans, each one louder than the last. As soon as we stepped into the hallway, the temperature seemed to dip, an icy current swirling around our ankles. My flashlight revealed walls marked with faint scratches, or maybe they'd always been there. But I was only now noticing. A strangled gurgle at our feet made my pulse skip. The figure we were supporting gasped for air, eyes rolling back. I felt dizzy with helplessness. Envelop. We had no medical supplies, no knowledge of how to treat injuries that might run far deeper than bruises. My friend tried to speak calming words, but even that felt futile, overshadowed by the house's ominous hush. Reaching the top of the staircase, We halted. The path below us was swallowed by gloom. The single window on this floor admitted almost no light, and the battery in one of our flashlights began to flicker ominously. A clatter from behind, a sensation like a door being wrenched open, made me spin around. But I saw nothing, only the open room with that dreadful cabinet cast in long shadows. My throat tightened. We needed to move, no matter how terrifying the descent. Step by agonizing step, we started down the stairs, holding tightly to the banister. Each creak boomed in my ears. The person slumped against us, let out a quivering moan, as if each jostle caused fresh agony. I tried to whisper reassurance, but my voice came out thin and unsure. All that mattered was reaching the exit. The darkness below beckoned ominously, as though daring us to proceed. At the foot of the stairs, the living room sprawled in eerie stillness, the same space where we'd first felt the shock of that midnight knock. Our lantern burned low on the mantel, casting an unsteady glow that did nothing to soothe my nerves. The floors, the walls, the discarded furniture, everything radiated an almost palpable tension. I caught a glimpse of movement near the front door, just a flicker in the corner of my eye. When I aimed my flashlight that way, nothing remained but the faint lines of the wooden panels. I tried not to let the fear paralyze me. Adjusting my grip on the injured figure, I nodded to my companions, and we trudged forward. The front door loomed a few yards away, yet it felt like a mile. Every breath I took seemed to echo, a drumbeat of desperation. Something in the corners, perhaps the shape of a coat rack or a broken chair, seemed to shift under the flickering lantern light, creating illusions of looming silhouettes. When we finally drew close to the door, a heavy thud struck the back wall of the living room. My heart jumped into my throat. Dust cascaded from the rafters. Envelop. The unconscious figure let out a whimper, spiking my determination to reach that door. My hand seized the handle, twisting so hard I worried it might snap. The door refused at first, almost like it had been locked from outside or sealed by the very house. My friend slammed a shoulder against it, generating a resonant crash that sent another wave of dust swirling down. Then, with a jolt, the door gave, letting in a rush of night air so cold it stung my lungs. And else, a small flood of moonlight washed over the threshold, revealing the battered porch. Relief coursed through me, but I didn't dare let my guard down. We dragged the injured person onto the porch, half falling onto the creaking boards. The wind howled around us, tugging at our clothes, as if trying to pull us back inside. My flashlight swept across the yard, confirming it was empty. Just the same gnarly trees and overgrown path. No sign of help. My chest tightened. No phone. No immediate way to call for an ambulance. The house loomed behind us, its windows dark, except for that single glow in the living room. The front door, battered and half hanging off the hinge, looked almost alive, like a gaping maw ready to swallow anyone foolish enough to linger. A raspy cough from the battered figure snapped me out of my haze. envelop. Ha, by. We maneuvered them carefully down the porch steps, nearly slipping on the dew-slicked boards. My mind ran wild with scenarios. Finding a car, calling for rescue, ensuring we weren't followed by whatever had inflicted such torment. The moon offered minimal guidance, casting long shadows across the yard, where each shake could hide untold threats. Yet we pressed on, determined to escape the suffocating presence of that house. With stumbling feet, we reached the edge of the dirt path leading to the main road. It was the only hope we had. If we could make it that far, maybe we'd flag down a passing driver or find a phone in a nearby property. The injured person seemed barely conscious, each breath a wheeze echoing in the cold night air. I refused to look back at the house. Some instinct told me that if I did, I might glimpse a silhouette watching from an upper window, silently marking our flight. As we progressed, the crunch of gravel underfoot felt surreal, a hollow sensation creeping through my chest. Once we escaped, how would we ever explain what we found? My mind still reeled at the idea that we'd discovered an actual victim in a chained cabinet. And what about the deeper secrets implied by the battered walls and the eerie noises that haunted every corridor? I forced those questions aside for the moment, focusing on placing one foot in front of the other. The darkness ahead might be terrifying, but it felt infinitely safer than the madness we were leaving behind. I tried to steady my breathing, ignoring the sharp ache in my arms and the swirl of dread in my stomach. The only thing that mattered was getting this person to safety. Yet, even as I told myself that, a prickling on the back of my neck suggested the house influence wouldn't end the moment we crossed its boundary. Some horrors, once encountered, leave marks that daylight can't erase. I pressed onward into the night, clutching the limp figure as my heart thundered with every stumbling step. The gravel beneath my shoes crunched in a steady rhythm, and the cold air scraped my lungs, making each breath feel like a minor triumph. My companions flanked me, silhouettes, tense with determination and dread. Our sole objective was to find help before this person in our arms stopped breathing altogether. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that something from that house still hovered behind us, a malevolent awareness that refused to let us slip away unobserved. The moonlight offered enough illumination for me to see a thin strip of asphalt looming ahead. Relief and anxiety mingled in my chest at the sight of the deserted road stretched out under a canopy of gnarled trees. There wasn't a street lamp in sight, only that dull silver glow. My arms trembled from the weight, my muscles raw from the effort of carrying someone who seemed perilously close to fading. I sensed the quiet raggedness of their breathing and a series of weak coughs. Each sound reminded me how little time we might have left. We made it to the roadside, panting in the gloom. My flashlight stuttered, threatening to give out completely. The weak beam revealed only cracked asphalt and overgrown weeds along the shoulder. In the distance, there was no sign of approaching headlights or the comforting hum of an engine. A hush pervaded this rural stretch, making me feel we might as well have been in a forgotten world. Every so often, leaves rustled overhead, and I couldn't tell if it was merely the wind or something else slinking through the undergrowth. My throat felt tight as we eased the injured individual onto a soft patch of grass. By the edge of the ditch, a pained moan escaped their lips, prompting one of my companions to kneel and check for any obvious wounds. The flickering flashlight revealed discolored bruises and faint scabs, but we had no proper medical training. All I could do was fumble for a half-empty water bottle that one of us had stashed in a backpack. When I trickled a small amount onto their cracked lips, they shivered from the chill. An uneasy lull fell over us. Each second, dragging, fear gnawed at my mind, whispering that if no car came, if no one chanced upon us, we might be forced to return to that horrible house in a last-ditch effort to find supplies or a phone. The thought made me sick with panic. My gaze flicked back to the crooked silhouette of that structure in the far distance, barely discernible through twisted branches. Even at this remove, it felt like it was watching us with silent glee, confident we couldn't truly escape its shadow. I forced down the terror, standing up and peering both ways, along the road. Nothing stirred, not a single lamp in a window, or a flicker of movement. My companions and I traded worried glances. The night seemed too still, as if nature itself recoiled from the presence of that place. I swallowed hard, the tang of dread coating my tongue. We might have to walk, maybe a mile, maybe more, carrying someone on the brink of collapse. My arms already burned from exhaustion. A rustle in the nearby brush caught my attention. I whipped my flashlight around, pulse hammering, and knew the glare fell on an empty patch of weeds, though a swirl of dust or pollen drifted through the beam. My instincts screamed that eyes were on us, but I couldn't see from where. The memory of all those improbable noises and shifting shadows in the corridors replayed in my head. Even outside, the sense of being pursued hadn't disappeared. I steeled myself, ignoring my pounding heart, and bent to hoist the battered figure again. My companions moved to assist, each of us determined not to abandon this person. The moan that followed suggested they were partially conscious, but too weak to speak. A wave of anger flared inside me at the cruelty someone had inflicted. I was desperate for an answer. Who had locked them in that cabinet, and why? But immediate questions had to wait. Survival first. Atun Municipal. We set off along the crumbling shoulder of the road, half carrying, half guiding the injured soul. The flashlight gave one final sputter before going dark, plunging us into moonlit dimness. Anxiety sharpened as we stumbled over uneven ground, arms trembling with the effort. Each step felt like a tiny war against the urge to give in and collapse. The night wind seemed to cut deeper out here, rattling branches against each other in soft percussion. A faint glow on the horizon teased me into thinking it could be headlights. I strained my eyes, but it vanished behind a stand of pines, leaving me uncertain if I'd even seen it. Our progress slowed, the injured figure sagging more heavily. My shoulders and back screamed for relief. I had to grit my teeth against the urge to set them down again, for fear they'd never rise. Minutes, or possibly hours, slipped by in a haze of stumbling exhaustion. Just when I thought all hope might be lost, a flicker of light flared near a bend in the road. My pulse throbbed. It didn't look like a car, more like a lamplight or a flashlight. Either way, it was our best shot. Summoning a final burst of energy, I motioned for the others to follow. We veered toward that dim brightness, hearts pounding with fragile optimism. Rounding a curve, we came upon a small rustic cabin set back from the road, a single lantern hanging on its porch. My eyes stung with relief at the sight of a building that didn't radiate malevolence. The windows were shuttered, and no smoke rose from the chimney. But the mere presence of that glow brought hope. I approached, treading carefully across a yard scattered with old barrels and rusted tools. A hollow silence enveloped the scene, broken only by the ragged breath of the person we carried. Reaching the porch, I noticed the lantern was actually a battery-powered light, half covered in dust. Perhaps whoever lived here wasn't around, or had fled. I tested the doorknob. Locked. I called out, but my voice seemed to die in the still air. Despite my guilt at the idea of forcing entry, desperation outweighed decorum. We had an injured survivor in dire need, and time wasn't on our side. With my companion's help, I set the unconscious figure against the porch rail and tried a window. The pane rattled but wouldn't budge. My friend attempted the door again, this time putting more force behind it. The wood groaned, hinges straining. I felt uneasy about breaking in, but what choice did we have? A life was at stake. The door yielded with a loud crack, swinging open onto a modest interior that smelled of stale coffee and disuse. My flashlight was dead, so I relied on the porch lantern's faint beam as I stepped inside. The space looked deserted, shadows hugging a worn couch, a dusty table with mismatched chairs, a kitchen area with an aging stove. There was no immediate sign of a phone or any modern electronics, just outdated magazines strewn on the counter. My companions carefully brought the injured person inside, laying them on the couch. I checked drawers, rummaging for anything resembling bandages or even a workable flashlight. The sinking realization hit. It was likely no one had lived here for weeks, if not months. A battered radio by the sink refused to show any signs of life. If I'd harbored hopes of calling an ambulance from here, those hopes were dashed. A low moan brought me back to the couch. The figure shifted, lips parted, as though they might try speaking. I knelt and tilted my ear close. Their breath smelled faintly of blood, and they choked out a few incoherent syllables, words too fractured to interpret. I felt helpless, fumbling through the cabin's limited resources. A grim sense of urgency gnawed at me. Our only chance might be to keep moving until we found an actual phone. But my legs felt ready to buckle, and I doubted the others fared any better. In the silence that followed, I became painfully aware of how vulnerable we were, huddled in a strange place, with no way to lock out the nightmares behind us. My mind drifted back to the heavy chain, the battered cabinet, and the horrifying secrets bound up in that old house. Had we unknowingly unleashed something that would follow us? Eptuvianen, Substanintona. Vogt. Every whisper of wind against the cabin's walls made me flinch, half expecting a clawed hand or a silent silhouette to appear at a window. I forced myself to search the few cabinets in the kitchen. Dust motes spun in the lantern light, revealing nothing useful. Just a couple of cans of expired soup, a torn box of tea bags, and a worn first aid kit, missing almost everything except a roll of gauze. Still, I grabbed that gauze as if it were gold, returning to the couch to wrap it around the worst of the figure's wounds. The motion triggered fresh whimpers of pain. My companions hovered, faces drawn, as we tried to reassure this stranger in hushed, shaky tones. With what little we could do complete, we slumped onto the floor, or against the walls, straining our ears for any outside disturbance. The cabin felt slightly safer than the open road, but it also felt like a precarious refuge. My thoughts swirled. Should we risk traveling again before dawn, or hunker down until there was enough daylight to navigate safely? My eyes stung with exhaustion, yet the adrenaline still surged, making genuine rest impossible. Time stretched, punctuated only by the labored breathing of the injured soul and our own unsteady hearts. Wells. The distant hoot of an owl reminded me we were isolated in the wilderness, far from the creature comforts of civilization. I tried to quell the dread building in my chest, telling myself that morning would break, that we'd flag down help. But a darker corner of my mind whispered that the horrors we'd confronted in that house wouldn't fade just because we'd fled. Some mysteries cling too tightly, unwilling to release their grip on those who dare disturb them. A sudden rattle at the front door jerked me upright. It could have been the wind or a branch tapping, but I couldn't banish the image of that house from my thoughts. My breath caught, heart fluttering like trapped birds. We all froze, tension thrumming as we stared at the door. Silence fell again, deeper this time, the cabin's interior thick with suspense. Every nerve in my body screamed that we might still be pursued, that we'd led something malevolent right to this haven. My gaze wandered to the battered figure on the couch, who twitched in uneasy slumber. It was a harsh reminder that our presence here might not be a coincidence. If that house contained a force bent on reclaiming what we'd taken, we might soon face a fate worse than anything we'd already seen. I found myself clutching the lantern's handle so tightly that my knuckles felt numb. heart drumming against my ribs as I locked my gaze on the cabin door. The rattle hadn't returned, yet I could still taste its echo in the air, like the residue of an unspoken threat. My companions exchanged tense looks, each of us silently acknowledging that the worst might not be over. The battered figure on the couch lay quiet now, breath rasping in strained, uneven patterns. A single flame in the cabin's oil lamp illuminated their bruised face, casting quivering shadows that gave their appearance an otherworldly pallor. I rose to my feet, carefully stepping around the scattered items we'd hastily dropped in our scramble to tend to the wounded soul. Every step felt heavier, weighed down by the memory of that house and what we'd discovered. The mere thought of that place, a labyrinth of damp corridors, midnight knocks, and a locked cabinet hiding a living nightmare, was enough to set my pulse racing again. Outside, a hush dominated the pine-studded landscape. The moonbeams drifting through dusty windows offered only slight comfort, reminding me that dawn was still hours away. One of my friends ventured a glance at the door we'd forced open, the splintered wood revealing the makeshift damage left by our entry. Without a lock or barricade, the cabin was hardly any safer than the open road. I shuddered, recalling the soft tapping on the porch door back at that old house. How something had tested the boundary before we even saw it. The echo of that memory sharpened my dread. Could it track us here? But the injured figure stirred, letting out a tortured breath. A quick glance told me we had to act soon. Blood caked around old wounds. Wood tried to bandage with meager supplies. Their eyelids fluttered, and I dared hope for a moment of clarity, but they slipped back into a vacant daze almost immediately. My attempts to whisper words of reassurance felt hollow. The frail rise and fall of their chest underscored our helplessness, determined to do something, anything. I stepped over to the narrow hallway leading deeper into the cabin. The structure couldn't have been large, maybe just a bedroom or storage closet in back. My lantern's glow painted the walls with a wavering amber sheen, revealing a scattering of muddy footprints and a pile of rumpled blankets shoved into a corner, possibly left behind by the previous occupant. Each breath of the stale air felt like inhaling dust and worry, nudging open a door that appeared to lead to a small bedroom. I flicked the lantern's light around. A sagging mattress occupied most of the floor, bare springs visible where the fabric had torn. A single dresser, half open, revealed nothing but scattered clothing. No phone, no medical kit, nothing of real value. My shoulders slumped in frustration, each find more useless than the last. At least the bed might offer a better place for the injured figure than that cramped couch. I returned to the living area, quietly explaining that we should move the wounded person to the bedroom. My friends agreed with nods and murmurs, none of us daring to speak in a normal volume, as though we might attract attention from the darkness outside. We carefully hoisted the limp form, inching down the short corridor. Their body felt lighter than before, a terrible sign that spoke of dwindling strength. When we laid them on the worn mattress, their chest heaved in protest, eliciting a low moan that cut me to the core. Searching for water, I found only a shallow basin at the edge of the kitchen area, fed by what might have once been a pump. A twist of the handle released a trickle of murky liquid that smelled earthy and stale. But it was all we had. With shaky hands, I filled a small tin cup and brought it back, hoping to coax a few drops between cracked lips. Each half swallow triggered a wince of pain, but at least they were swallowing. Time crawled, each minute an exercise in endurance. My friend knelt by the bed, gently dabbing at the figure's brow, with the corner of a ragweed moistened in the basin. I hovered near the door, straining my ears for any noise outside the cabin. Maybe a passing car, maybe the dreaded shuffle of something else. My mind cycled through worst-case scenarios, picturing shapes flickering beyond the tree line, closing in under the cloak of night. I exhaled slowly, reminding myself that nothing had come since we arrived. Shh, possibly we'd managed to slip free. Possibly. A soft creak jerked my attention back to the bedroom. Phew! The injured person's eyes were open, wide and glassy. Their lips moved, forming silent words that never reached the air. I took a step closer, my heart pounding, and whispered a gentle encouragement. After a moment, they murmured what sounded like a name or a warning. I couldn't be sure. The syllables were muddled, broken by labored breathing. I glanced at my companions, who seemed just as uncertain. We waited, barely daring to breathe, but the figure drifted again into semi-consciousness, leaving us with no answers. It gnawed at me. We needed real help, not just guesswork in a stranger's cabin. My phone was dead. The road outside was silent. The only glimmer of hope was that eventually daylight would come, and maybe we could flag down assistance. Yet I couldn't shrug off the fear that the evil associated with that house would chase us if we lingered. My nerves buzzed with conflicting urges. Stay put and care for this person, or keep moving through the night in search of civilization. I ventured outside to check for any sign of activity, bundling my jacket tight against the chill. The lantern's wan glow lit only a small circle. Beyond that circle, pines rustled in the breeze. A faint sliver of moon outlined the path leading back to the road, an uneven route we'd stumbled along earlier. I stood there, focusing on my breath to keep panic at bay. The quiet pressed in from all sides, a stillness that felt too complete. A distant snap made me spin, lantern trembling in my grasp. I peered into the darkness, adrenaline surging. Moments passed, thick with tension. Then, nothing. Perhaps a branch had simply fallen from a nearby tree. My thoughts, however, drifted to the possibility of something stalking us. I was done dismissing ominous sounds as coincidence. The events in that house had wrecked my confidence in logic. My pulse hammered even as I willed my legs to remain steady. Returning inside, I reported that the exterior seemed calm, though it provided no real comfort. My friends quietly fussed over the wounded figure, re-wetting the cloth and placing an extra blanket from the dresser over them. The sight filled me with a fierce resolve. We'd saved this person from that wretched imprisonment. We couldn't fail them now. Despite the numbness in my limbs, I was ready to act at a moment's notice if the threat manifested. As the minutes stretched into what felt like an endless vigil, I found myself staring at the cabin's sparse features. The chipped paint on the walls, the thin cracks in the windows, the old rocking chair in the corner, still as death. My mind flickered with images of us back in that house, hearing the initial knock that started it all. I tried to banish the memory, but it clung to my consciousness, an unwelcome reminder that once we witnessed true darkness, it was no simple matter to walk away unscathed. A soft sound from the mattress snapped me out of my reflection. The figure's eyes were half open again. This time, their lips moved, forming what sounded like a plea. My friend leaned in, struggling to catch the whispered fragment. I hovered nearby, tension carving every muscle rigid. Would they reveal the name of whoever did this, or describe a terror that lurked beyond human explanation? Their voice rasped, something that might have been a warning to leave. I glimpsed confusion and alarm in their half-lidded gaze, which seemed to dart around the cabin as though searching for a threat. For a split second, I feared they sensed something inside these walls that we didn't. Then they sagged against the pillow, breath rattling in shallow bursts. My companions and I exchanged frantic looks, frustration gnawing at us. This person might be the only living proof of what horrors that house contained, if they survived. A flash of lightning ignited the window, followed by a distant crack of thunder. The sudden shift in weather cast an electric tension through the cabin's stale air. We stiffened, collectively realizing that a storm was rolling in. The rainfall could complicate everything: travel along the road, attempts to keep the injuries clean, even our hopes for outside help. As droplets began tapping on the roof, soft at first, a chill slithered down my spine, telling me the night might still hold one final ordeal for us. I pressed my palm against the window, peering into the dark beyond as the rain gathered force, tapping in a nervous rhythm along the roof. Lightning flickered intermittently, momentarily revealing the dense pines and the winding road. Each brilliant flash sent my pulse racing, reminding me how precarious our sanctuary was. The battered cabin walls creaked under the wind's assault, as if warning that they couldn't offer full protection if anything, human or otherwise, wanted it. Behind me, the injured figure groaned softly on the bed, trapped in a fog of pain and delirium. One of my companions knelt at the bedside, whispering encouragement and adjusting the threadbare blankets for what little warmth they could offer. Sula, say your dearest, what you see. The storm's sudden intensity made the interior grow colder, and a swirl of damp air slipped through the cracks in the walls, rattling the meager lantern flame. My mind strayed to that house, to the locked cabinet where we'd found this broken soul, and to the lingering terror that we might not have left its darkness fully behind. Another clap of thunder reverberated, making the floor vibrate. I caught my breath, anxious that the noise might cover other sounds we'd need to hear. Footsteps on the porch, maybe, or the faint scratch of someone prowling outside. Lightning flared again, revealing the silhouette of trees bowed in the gusts. My heart twisted at the thought of having to flee into such a downpour if circumstances demanded it. But the alternative, staying put should some malevolent force arrive, felt equally daunting. I forced my attention back to our immediate concerns, stepping away from the window. My other friend rummaged through drawers in a corner table, searching for anything remotely helpful. More bandages, maybe a radio with working batteries. Their frustrated sigh told me that I'd found nothing of use. Everyone, undebilus. This cabin was more an abandoned shell than a real haven. The reality loomed heavier with each passing moment, reminding us how poorly equipped we were to handle the situation. In the bedroom, the figure's harsh breathing faltered, triggering another wave of uncertainty. My friend brushed damp hair from their brow, pressing a torn cloth to the fresh beads of sweat. The injured person's eyes fluttered open, fixating on some point in the middle of the ceiling, as if perceiving a threat only they could see. A tremor ran through their body before they fell back into that uneasy half-sleep. I tried to ignore the knot in my stomach, silently praying morning would come soon. The storm intensified, sheets of rain drumming on the roof. Obeying ray. One particularly bright flash illuminated the entire cabin, revealing every speck of dust suspended in the air. For an instant, I was struck by how bleak our surroundings truly were. Warped floorboards, peeling wallpaper, a flimsy door would forced open. The next crash of thunder nearly drowned out my startled gasp when I realized I heard something else. A muffled sound beyond the cabin's walls, like a shuffle in the sodden grass. I exchanged a sharp look with the friend who stood closest to me. Ianing, Sadet Pass. They nodded in alarm, having heard it too. We both moved toward the small window that overlooked the porch. Raindrops plastered the glass, making it hard to see. Another lightning bolt flickered, bright enough that I thought I saw a shape flicker past the corner of the cabin, an outline there 1 second, gone the next. My skin prickled. I lifted the lantern closer to the pane, hoping for a better view. But the outside remained an indistinct mass of shadows and water. A lump formed in my throat at the possibility we weren't alone. I recalled how we'd half expected something to follow us from that house, how the battered soul lying in the back room had spoken bits of warnings and fear. My stomach churned with the realization that if any danger was out there now, it could exploit the storm's chaos to approach unnoticed. Another rumble of thunder shook the beams overhead, as if the skies themselves conspired to keep us trapped and vulnerable. I steeled myself and told the others what I'd seen. or thought I'd seen. My friend at the bedside looked torn between keeping vigil over the injured person and rushing to secure the cabin's entrance. We compromised. One would remain with our patient, while I, along with the companion by the window, would attempt to barricade the door as best we could. Despite its flimsy condition, we lacked proper tools, so a few battered chairs and a heavy trunk we'd found in the corner had to suffice. Gritting my teeth, I shoved the trunk across the threshold. The legs of the chairs scraped over the floorboards, echoing in the cramped space. Thunder boomed again, and I flinched, momentarily convinced it masked a knock or clawing from outside. Rain hammered louder, and each droplet felt like a small note in a growing symphony of dread. My heart refused to settle, pulsing with every swirl of wind. We stood back, surveying our makeshift barricade. It looked laughably weak, but hopefully it would at least slow down an intruder long enough for us to react. My friend wiped a trembling hand across their brow. I understood how they felt. None of us wanted to speak of that house again, yet the memory hung like a haze. The midnight knock, the bizarre cabinet, the savage injuries. We'd only begun to grasp the nightmarish extent of what we'd interrupted. Returning to the bedroom, we found our wounded companion trembling under the old blankets. The rawness in their breathing frightened me. Each cough seemed to shake their entire frame, as if pushing them closer to the edge. My friend dabbed their forehead again, voice hushed with worry. Outside, the wind howled, snaking through cracks in the walls. The entire cabin shuddered, a weathered fortress barely withstanding the elements. I longed for daybreak, for the sun to chase away the claustrophobic darkness. A loud, yet a gnawing sense deep in my gut warned that daylight might not be enough. There are some evils that hide in broad view, unyielding to the sun's rays. Despite my best efforts to keep a logical mind, to remind myself that we'd cut ties with that dreadful place, I couldn't banish the lingering impression that something followed us, be it an actual pursuer or the shadow of our own terror. As the minutes dragged on, the patient stirred, eyelids half lowered, mouth moving in delirious whispers. I leaned down, ears straining to catch any coherent word. The voice cracked out a jumbled phrase that sounded like a mix of fear and a plea. Locket never opened, before fading into shallow breaths again. My hair stood on end. What exactly were they warning us about? Every day, Suptug Uvoa. Had we unleashed something when we pried that cabinet open? A splintering crash echoed beyond the cabin walls, making the lantern flicker in my grip. My friend clapped a hand over their mouth to stifle a gasp. We both whipped around toward the main room, hearts hammering. Another lightning flash revealed nothing but the wet gloom through the windows. A swirl of wind-swept debris crossing the yard. I tried to calm my nerves. Maybe a tree branch or part of the old porch had given way under the storm's assault. Still, my imagination conjured an image of a door forced open or a window shattered. The tension became suffocating. I suggested we take shifts, with one person always on guard near the window. Nobody argued. I claimed the first watch, determined to stand by the narrow glass and keep an eye on the swirling night. The rest tried to find a moment's rest near the bedroom doorway, hoping to remain close enough if our patient needed immediate care. The cabin felt too small and too large at once, every knot in the wood grain seeming to stare back like tiny, ancient eyes. Wind-driven rain continued its assault, the rafters overhead groaning under the barrage. Occasionally, lightning illuminated the distance where the battered outlines of trees bent in submission. My mind flickered back to the house again, replaying the worst moments. That chain snapping, revealing a person crumpled inside like some cruel trophy. I clenched my fist around the lantern handle, reminding myself we had done the right thing by rescuing them. But did that choice come at the price of our safety? Or even theirs? Hours crawled by in that tense routine of watching and listening. Thunder receded to a growling murmur, though the rain persisted. Now and then I thought I saw motion at the cabin's edge, branches, or maybe fleeting silhouettes. Each time I tensed, ready to call for help, but nothing materialized. My friend dozed fitfully, while the other occasionally checked the injured soul's pulse, rummaging for more cloth to stanch any renewed bleeding. The lack of any tangible threat should have relieved me, but my heart refused to quiet. Eventually, the storm's fury began to ease. The wind slackened, and the rain lessened to a steady patter. My legs ached from standing, my eyes sore from trying to pierce the gloom. The cabin's interior seemed almost peaceful, if one could forget the dire circumstances and the battered figure fighting for life in the next room. A hint of dawn might be approaching, though the clouds masked any obvious glow. I clung to that sliver of optimism. If we could hold out just a bit longer, maybe we'd find real help by daylight. No one dared mention plans for the next steps in front of the injured individual, as if acknowledging our uncertainty would worsen their despair. A series of short coughs drew me back to the bedroom. Their breaths came quick, shallow, another wave of pain, perhaps. I mumbled incoherent reassurances, wishing we had proper medical training or supplies. Outside, the persistent drip of rain off the eaves seemed almost a countdown, ticking away precious minutes. I couldn't shake the awareness that we might be racing against forces we only partially understood. The night had proven that, if something lurked beyond the pines, waiting for its chance to reclaim the unfortunate soul we'd rescued, we had no guarantee a battered door and a few chairs would keep it at bay. My spine chilled at the thought that the house and its secrets might stretch far beyond the threshold we'd crossed. For the moment, all I could do was maintain my vigil and hope that once the sun broke, whatever horrors had been unleashed would retreat, granting us time to move this person to real medical attention. I held onto that image of dawn, pale light creeping through the battered windows, revealing a safe route down the road, maybe even an early traveler who'd stop and lend a hand. But my thoughts kept returning to the last words. The injured individual had managed. Lock it. Never opened. I wasn't sure what locked portal they meant. The cabinet we'd broken into, or something deeper. I only knew our decision to release them had changed everything, and that reckoning might still lie ahead. I clung to the ragged hope that dawn would bring real answers, mind churning in the half-light, as the storm lost some of its force outside. A muffled drip echoed from one corner of the cabin, the accumulation of water finally slipping through a crack in the roof. My companion patted the floorboards in search of a bucket or bowl to catch the leak. Outside the window, the world remained a haze of dripping silhouettes. Even with the rain easing, I couldn't see more than a faint outline of the pines, trunks shimmering under the moon's waning glow. The battered figure on the bed stirred, expelling a breath that wrenched my attention back. I crossed to them, kneeling on a patched rug to check for any shift in their vitals. Their skin felt clammy, their brow damp, despite the colder air. When I brushed aside a lock of matted hair, they opened their eyes in a quick flutter, staring through me as though lost in a nightmare. A hoarse whisper escaped. Shouldn't have. The last word trailed into raw air. My pulse hammered. I wondered if they meant we shouldn't have released them from that house, from that wretched cabinet. Regret gnawed at me, because as much as I wanted to believe we had acted heroically, each moment here told me our rescue had weighty consequences. I tried to offer a soothing reassurance, an instinctive murmur of, "It's okay, we're here." But the lines on their face only deepened. A stealth, and their gaze fixed on something past my shoulder, as if detecting a presence I was too blind to see. A light, scraping noise made my stomach twist with alarm. It came from outside, near the porch. My eyes darted to the makeshift barricade we'd rigged across the door. A testament to our desperation. My friend, standing watch at the window, held up a hand in warning, indicating they'd heard it too. In the muted hush, after the rain, the scrape repeated, a stealthy edge that made my mouth go dry. Lightning had settled into the distance, so the flicker of any shapes beyond the porch was minimal. Just the lamp's tenuous glow inside the cabin. I willed my heartbeat to slow, listening for footsteps or the clank of metal. Instead, everything melted into silence, as if the wind itself held its breath. My friend and I shared a look of uneasy relief. Maybe it was a stray branch in the breeze, or an animal sniffing around. But the tension sank deeper in my bones, refusing to fade. Returning my focus to the bed, I noticed that our injured companion had drifted again into that limbo between awareness and unconsciousness. We had almost no supplies left. The gauze was stained and damp, and the battered first aid box held only a few scraps of cotton. I attempted to rearrange the blanket for extra warmth. Their breath hitched in a sequence of gasps, as though each inhale might fail to emerge. My companion quietly checked their pulse, casting me a worried glance that confirmed our fears. The pulse was weak, too light, and too fast. I rose to my feet, resolving we'd have to do something drastic soon. Air, Maybe after the storm fully passed, we could risk traveling down the road on foot, even if it meant slogging through mud and water. Remaining here felt like an invitation for fate to corner us. I recalled the final words the wounded soul had formed. Lock it. Never open. A swirl of dread coiled in my gut. Did that mean the house had other sealed chambers? Or that the act of unsealing that cabinet had triggered some release? I suppressed a shiver, berating myself for getting lost in speculation. Survival came first. An abrupt gust rattled the walls, and the lantern flame wavered, flaring high before settling again. In that flicker, I glimpsed my friend's tight expression, jaw clenched as they hovered near the window. They mouthed something. I saw it again, and my pulse lurched. I joined them, peering through the warped glass, and the yard was a soggy blur, puddles reflecting the moon's pale glow. For several seconds, I saw nothing. Then, near the edge of the tree line, a shape flickered into sight. It was low to the ground, or perhaps it simply crouched. Nothing definite, just an outline. My skin crawled with the certainty that it moved against the backdrop of wet bark, then vanished with uncanny speed. A jolt of terror seized me, though I tried to keep my reaction contained, so as not to alarm the wounded figure or my other companion. The presence was real. Maybe it had followed us from that hateful house. Or maybe it was something else entirely, drawn by the echo of what we'd unearthed. The idea it might be circling the cabin, testing for weaknesses, made my throat go dry. I whispered to my friend that we'd have to keep watch more carefully. This flimsy structure wouldn't stop an intruder determined to get in. The minutes slogged by in suffocating unease. We took turns edging around the single-room main area, checking corners, verifying that the makeshift barricade remained secure. Each random creak of the floor threatened to jolt my nerves. My other companion knelt by the bed, smoothing the patient's hair back as they drifted in and out of pained half-sleep. The storm's lull did little to comfort any of us. Instead, it amplified the sense that we were caught in a suspenseful calm, waiting for something yet to come. I worked up the nerve to crack the door a fraction, pressing an ear to the gap. The faint smell of wet earth filtered in. Low thunder murmured far away, the remnants of the storm's fury. I heard the occasional drip from the porch roof, but not much else. Even so, that fleeting glimpse of a shape among the trees had lodged itself in my mind like a splinter, with that looming question: had we truly escaped the shadow of the house, or had it found new ground here? I tightened my hand on the doorknob, battling the urge to lock myself in further. When I turned back, my friend beckoned me to the bedside again. The injured figure was stirring, eyes glassy, with a flicker of lucidity. They moved their lips, mouthing the same half-syllables that might have been locked or lost. My ears strained for clarity, but only disjointed fragments emerged. No time showed left, not finished. It felt like a cryptic puzzle, each piece sliding out of reach just when it seemed to form a coherent warning. My frustration mingled with pity. Part of me wanted to press them for details, demand to know what evil had them caged in that cabinet, or what monstrous plan required locking them away. But they were too weak, their body trembling with the strain of each breath. One of my companions shot me a silent plea. "Don't push." So I swallowed my questions and brushed my fingertips over the back of the figure's hand, a wordless attempt at assurance. Lightning flared again, not as bright, revealing the bedraggled state of the cabin interior. I noticed for the first time faint markings carved into one corner of the wooden ceiling, as though someone had scratched them with a knife. They resembled small crosses or intersecting lines. Could have been random graffiti from past occupants, or something more ominous. My heart sank further. Every new detail about this place gnawed at my nerves. Finally, the first trace of a pre-dawn glow bled into the sky, diluting the night's thick black. I wasn't sure exactly when it started, just that my eyes slowly picked out the outlines of pines without relying on the lantern's flicker. My chest loosened marginally. Dawn didn't guarantee safety, but it meant we could leave without fumbling. In darkness, I murmured this plan to my friends. As soon as the light was enough to see the road, we'd venture out, find real help for the wounded. One of them pointed out how frail our patient had grown. Moving might be risky. Beul might be risky. But staying in a cabin we couldn't defend felt equally foolish. We compromised. If, within the next hour, the figure's condition seemed stable enough, we'd go. If not, perhaps I'd run ahead with one companion to locate a phone or a passing driver, while the other stayed behind. My stomach lurched at the thought of separating, conjuring images of that skulking silhouette outside. Yet, time was running out, not just for our battered friend, but also for our own sanity. I moved to the window and stared at the watery light, intensifying over the treetops. The storm had dwindled to a gentle drizzle, each drop a fragile note against the battered shingles. My reflection in the glass looked haunted, eyes shadowed, posture rigid. Briefly, I allowed the memory of that old house to surface, how it felt the moment we first heard the midnight knock, the tangle of fear and nerve that drove us to open doors best left shut. A tremor coursed through me. Perhaps we'd undone some boundary, letting in a darkness that could no longer be contained. Behind me, the patient's coughing spiked, a harsh rasp that suggested the race was nearing its climax. We had to act. Steeling myself, I turned, blood pounding in my ears as I announced it was time to try the road. My friends nodded, each face pale but resolute. We would gather what little we had, a few scraps of supplies, the lantern, the ragged blankets, and brace to carry the wounded figure if need be. Dawn would come fully soon, and with it a narrow chance at salvation, or at least a confrontation we could no longer avoid. I crouched beside the makeshift bed, bracing my arms under the limp figure. and gathering the last of my courage. The air in the cabin felt thinner now, the faint glow of morning touching the edges of the window and painting the walls a murky gray. My companions and I exchanged weary looks. We had spent the night in a haze of fear and half-hope, pinning everything on the idea that daylight would save us from shadows we couldn't fully name. Still, my heart hammered in my chest, certain that whatever watched us through the storm might still be out there, waiting. The injured soul stirred, breathing shallowly. I forced a smile, though exhaustion tugged at every muscle. "We're taking you somewhere safe," I murmured, unsure if they could even hear me. My friend stood behind, positioning ragged blankets around the patient's shoulders. The battered first aid kit lay abandoned, nearly empty, after our efforts to stave off infection and blood loss. Despite all, we'd barely improved their condition. Another spasm of coughing shuddered through them, and I thought I heard a faint word of protest, an echo of that warning about locked doors and never opening them. My chest tightened at the reminder. We had no choice. With careful effort, we eased the figure upright. Each moan felt like a wrench in my gut. My friend stepped to my side, taking part of the weight. The third member of our group hovered near the threshold, lantern held high, scanning the cabin's corners one final time. The walls bore the scars of dripping water, the floor coated in footprints from our panicked watch in the night. I swallowed hard, recalling the fleeting glimpses of movement outside, but the storm clouds were thinning, letting pale morning seep through. If we were going to move, now had to be the time. I nudged open the door, wincing at the protesting squeak. A draft of cool air greeted us, carrying the faint smell of soaked pine and muddy soil. The yard stretched out in glistening puddles, each reflecting the sky's subdued light. My breath fogged as I stepped onto the porch, half expecting to see that indistinct shape crouched among the trees. Nothing stirred, though I couldn't ignore the uneasy prickle on my skin. Dawn or not, a lingering sense of being watched remained. My companion led the way across the saturated ground, boots squelching in the mud. With every step, the injured figure sagged between us, feet dragging as we struggled not to slip. I glanced over my shoulder, finding the battered cabin receding into gloom behind us. A corner of my mind worried we might need to retreat there if we failed to find help, but dread pushed me forward, refusing to consider turning back. The shadow of that dreadful house and the horror we'd unearthed felt closer with every heartbeat. We trudged along the narrow road, relying on the muted sunrise to guide us. Treetops shimmered with leftover raindrops, giving the forest an almost tranquil facade. My arms ached from supporting the wounded soul, and my friend's pained wheezing told me they too were nearing their limit. But step by painful step, we pressed on, buoyed by the faint promise of what might lie beyond the next bend. A gas station, a farmhouse, any sign of life where we could call for rescue. The winding asphalt unfurled beneath our feet, its cracks filled with standing water. Occasionally, a breeze rattled branches overhead, making me tense up as though expecting some beast to leap from cover. The memory of that fleeting silhouette from the night clung to my mind, refusing to let me breathe easy. Each time I forced my gaze forward, telling myself daybreak was our shield. If anything roamed these woods, perhaps it only thrived under darkness. At last, a bend in the road revealed a more open patch of land, scattered with a few run-down shacks and a battered sign indicating a highway might be nearby. Relief jolted through me, though I stopped short upon realizing how deserted everything looked. The structures were little more than sagging frames, their windows missing. Still, it was a change from the unrelenting trees. As we approached, my eyes latched onto a faint wisp of smoke rising behind one shack's collapsed roof. Instinct told me it might be recent, suggesting a person could be close. And the dust on the bite, heart pounding. I directed our group that way, ignoring the burning in my arms. With every step, the injured figures' breaths grew more ragged, spurring me to quicken my pace. If we could just find someone, anyone, who still lived in these parts, we could place a call or beg a ride to the nearest clinic. Drawing nearer, I saw it was indeed a smoldering heap of wood, as though someone tried to burn debris recently. No people were visible, but a small path led around a corner. Before I could investigate further, the patient convulsed in a spasm of coughing that sent us both stumbling. I barely regained balance in time to keep them from falling face first into the mud, while my companion steadied the wounded soul. I circled the structure, calling out in a low voice. Only silence answered, broken by the drip of runoff from broken gutters. My disappointment gnawed at me, replaced by a nervous pang, as I scanned the area again. If no one was here, what next? Could we push onto the highway? Or would the figure's frailty demand we find shelter again? A stirring at the edge of my vision made me spin, half expecting that nightmarish outline from before. Instead, an old dog limped into view from behind a toppled fence, eyeing us warily. The animal's presence felt oddly comforting, a reminder that normal life persisted in some corners, even this far from civilization. It gave a sniff at the air, then trotted away, unconcerned. My shoulders loosened a fraction. Yet, if we were in immediate danger, perhaps the dog would have shown fear or aggression. With no better option, we pressed on, following the dog's route around the shack. As we rounded the corner, my chest clenched at the sight of a half-collapsed porch with a telephone cable trailing from a crooked pole. The chance of that line still functioning was slim, but I surged forward, hope battling exhaustion. My friend called after me, but I ignored the ache in my arms. And if there was even a 1% chance a phone existed inside, we had to try. I mounted the porch, ducking beneath splintered beams. Wow! Inside, the space was strewn with debris. Broken furniture, damp newspapers, a rusted stove. My heart sank The interior smelled of decay and stale smoke. But I forced myself to search. My frantic gaze landed on a small counter in what might once have been a kitchen. There, partially hidden by collapsed shelving, was an old rotary phone. I nearly cried out. Emne. Don't lives failed. Even if it was a long shot, it was more than we'd had before. Yanking the phone free, I held it up. The line was frayed, but I tried anyway, pressing the cold receiver to my ear. Static hissed. A dull, hopeless silence filled my head. And the civilian should. I tapped the cradle repeatedly, throat tight with frustration. The phone gave nothing back. Either the line was severed, or the entire network had been abandoned. My friend's face fell, mirroring my despair. I whispered an apology, though I wasn't even sure to whom. My companions, the wounded soul, or myself for daring to believe. A choking sound from behind signaled our patient had collapsed to the floor. The effort of standing too great, we scrambled to their side, propping them up against a broken cabinet. Their eyes fluttered open just enough to register the hopeless environment. An attempted breath rattled their ribcage. My friend tried to soothe them, voice trembling in fear that this was it. Our best shot squandered. Desperation flared in me. I refused to give up. Stumbling outside, I scanned the horizon for any sign of a passing vehicle or a distant farmhouse light. The only movement was the wind stirring puddles. I could feel time slipping away. The battered figure's last words echoed in my mind. A fragmented plea about something that should have remained locked. Whether that key referred to them or the house we fled, I might never know. My chest tightened at the thought that we had unleashed something beyond our comprehension. Summoning every last scrap of resolve, I returned to my companions, gently lifting the wounded soul again. Together, we limped back toward the road. We had to keep moving, no matter how futile it felt. If dawn wouldn't bring rescue, maybe the next mile would. Even as a cold dread in my gut insisted we were running in circles, I steadied my heart. We had each other, and we still had the will to fight. Beyond the battered trees and the watery sunrise, something waited. Maybe redemption, maybe a deeper horror. But we marched on, unwilling to let fate claim another victim without a fight. I remember the moment the wind began howling through Elmwood Pass in Virginia. The gusts slicing against the mountainside with a hollow moan that vibrated through my ribs. The four of us had set out in the dead of night, determined to solve the mystery of multiple disappearances that had seized local headlines. In one hand, I clutched the handheld camera. In the other, I steadied myself on damp, moss-covered rock. The slope was treacherous, especially with the swirling fog rolling off the cliffs, leaving every step uncertain. I could taste the tension on my tongue, a metallic tang that mixed with the late autumn chill. My companions moved around me in silhouettes, blurred by the moonlight and the mist. One of them carefully pointed an electromagnetic meter at the dark expanse, waiting for the needle to jump, while another aimed a flashlight at the ragged line of fir trees looming overhead. I slid my fingers across the phone in my pocket, recalling the voicemail that first drew us here. A brittle-sounding whisper cut short by static, the only connection anyone had received from the latest person to vanish. The memory of that faint plea still made my throat tighten, though I forced my breath to remain steady. As we crept deeper along the ridge, the ground underfoot began to shift from solid earth to loose gravel. Pebbles rattled down into the void, an echo dissolving into blackness. The sense of emptiness just below the ledge worked like an invisible tether on my nerves, reminding me that a single misstep might send me plunging into the chasms rumored to lie beneath the pass. The story spoke of caves and tunnels riddled with strange shapes, but no thorough exploration had ever come back with verifiable evidence. Only a handful of horrifying rumors and more missing people than any normal region should sustain. Suddenly, my camera's record light flickered, and I raised it almost by instinct. The lens captured the swirl of fog rippling across the horizon. But that was all I could see. My heart hammered, though I couldn't pinpoint why. The wind changed direction, swiping across the plateau and carrying a new odor, something rancid and vaguely reminiscent of spoiled meat. My stomach rolled at the unwelcome stench. In that moment, the hush that had reigned over our expedition cracked apart, replaced by the unsettling notion that we were no longer alone on this ridge. A scraping sound threaded through the night. It was faint, almost an afterthought, yet distinct enough to force my pulse into overdrive. I lifted my camera, angling it toward the nearest outcropping of boulders. My flashlight's glare cut through a patch of swirling fog, revealing only lichen and fractured stone. A breath caught in my throat, and I stayed rooted, listening for any follow-up noise. The others froze around me, though I avoided speaking. We had agreed to maintain as much silence as possible, partly to record any stray sounds that might erupt from the void, and partly to keep from startling each other into a panic. The wind carried a hushed, breathy note that might have been laughter, or perhaps just an odd swirl. My shoulders felt stiff as iron rods, tension creeping up the back of my neck. I recalled the final words on that voicemail, a promise that something unnamed lurked in the dark. As if to remind me of that fact, the electromagnetic meter at my companion's side gave a brief, jarring spike. Its needle fluttered, then sank. My chest tightened. We might have dismissed it as a glitch, if not for the lingering sense that a presence had drawn close enough to brush against our edges of reason. Stepping away from the ledge, I maneuvered across a set of half-buried timbers, remnants of an old trail marker, or perhaps a collapsed fence. My lungs felt starved for air, and I reminded myself to inhale. The lens of my camera kept rolling, capturing ephemeral glimpses of the mountainous terrain. Shadows licked at the corners of the frame, fleeting illusions conjured by swirling fog. It became harder to tell where the ground ended and the gloom began. Then, something flicked into my peripheral vision, a glimmer of movement near the tree line. My heart stumbled, but when I swung the camera to investigate, it caught only a shapeless smear of pale light. I swallowed, battling an upwelling of dread, uncertain if my mind was playing tricks, or if we truly had a watcher. I wondered how the others were coping, but we'd all agreed to keep quiet unless absolutely necessary. The hush weighed on me, amplifying every rustle of the breeze and the uneven cadence of my heartbeat. Creeping forward, I sank my boots into the mud, leaving deep impressions that glistened in the wan glow. Ahead, I sensed a depression in the terrain, perhaps an incline leading down to a hidden hollow. The pass had many such pockets, each rumored to harbor caverns or sinkholes. They seemed to beckon with a promise of hidden secrets, and I feared hidden horrors. If the rumors were correct, the missing people had ventured too close to these hidden voids, never to be seen again. My camera stuttered, losing focus for a breath before snapping back in. The brief disorientation rattled me, and a swirl of adrenaline surged. I paused, scanning the horizon once more. The moon peeked through a ragged hole in the clouds, bathing the landscape in silvery gloom. Across the uneven slope, a faint path emerged, the unsteady suggestion of footprints in the soft ground. My pulse quickened. Had the missing victims come this way, leaving behind these faint tracks? Edging closer, I lowered the camera, wanting to see with my own eyes. My foot slid, nearly causing me to pitch forward. I steadied myself, kneeling to examine the prints. Each impression seemed too large to be from a normal boot. The shape was distorted, as if a heavier body with elongated toes had pressed into the soil. My skin crawled, and no normal footwear produced a pattern like that, more reminiscent of an animal's paw, except it bore an unnerving shape, hinting at something neither fully human nor beast. My heart pounded, though I clenched my jaw, refusing to let panic overwhelm me. A soft hiss of wind caressed the back of my neck, and I whipped around, nearly tumbling. The ridge behind me was empty, but the strangest sensation persisted, as though unseen eyes studied my every motion. My grip on the camera threatened to slip from sweaty palms. For a moment I forgot about capturing evidence. Survival instincts roared, telling me to retreat, but I forced the impulse down. We had come here for answers, to find out if any faint chance remained to rescue those who'd vanished. From somewhere to my left, I sensed my companions edging in my direction, their shapes half lost in swirling vapor. We formed a cautious cluster, a silent vow of unity in the face of mounting dread. The wind died briefly, creating a bubble of calm that only magnified the tension. Then came a muted crunch, as if something massive moved behind the boulders. To our east, my chest constricted with renewed terror. I swept the camera that way, my mind alight with images of monstrous silhouettes. The moment stretched. The hush roared in my ears, my breath shallow. Then a flicker of movement, a pair of greenish glints, like eyes reflecting the moonlight, surfaced above a rock. My blood iced over. Lemurst over. I lifted the camera to capture it, but the lens wavered in trembling hands, and the glints vanished instantly. A beat of stunned silence followed, shattered by the pit of my stomach lurching in dread. Something watched us, and it moved with unsettling speed, as though it had tested our reaction and found it lacking. The meter spiked again in my peripheral vision, snapping me out of paralysis. I forced my feet to move, gesturing for the others to step away from the rocky cluster. We retreated a handful of yards, scanning the ledges. My heart hammered so loudly, I thought it might betray our presence to that hidden watcher. Yet no further sign emerged. At least, not visibly. The gloom swallowed everything, leaving me raw with anxiety, uncertain whether the threat had passed or simply bided its time. With a trembling exhale, I turned my camera off, deciding we needed to regroup. My thoughts were a storm of confusion. Had we come face to face with the reason so many had disappeared? If so, what chance did we stand against it? The ragged sense of dread told me we might already be in over our heads. Our heads. My breath formed small clouds in the chill, each one merging into the swirling haze as we retreated from the ridge. All the while, the shadows behind the boulders seemed to press in, as though urging us to wander just a little closer. Far below, the distant lights of a town blinked in the valley, oblivious to our silent struggle on the pass. My companions eased together in a tight formation, none of us daring to shatter the hush with words. Deep inside, I realized we all fought the same impulse, to flee these haunted slopes. Yet, the puzzle of the missing travelers and the cryptic message that brought us here refused to let me back down. I swallowed, bracing for the next subtle sign that something lurked. The wind resumed its mournful lament, and I wondered whether the mountain itself grieved, or if the lost souls were crying out from its hidden caverns. Lightning flared on the horizon, revealing the jagged silhouette of the Appalachian ridges for a moment. In that strobe of brilliance, I thought I caught sight of a lanky form slithering into a crevice. Shortstone. Then darkness returned, leaving me chilled to the marrow. Enuf. Deptut. My instincts burned to run, but I clenched my teeth, determined to press on. If there was any chance of uncovering the fate of those vanished hikers, if we could prevent more tragedies, we had to push beyond our fear. As I took a faltering step forward, the wind carried a new sound, faint but undeniably reminiscent of a low chuckle drifting through the pines. My nerves threatened to unravel, yet I forced my focus on the path. The footprints, the flicker of green eyes, the drifting smell of decay, they all pointed to something unnatural lurking in these wilds. With each passing moment, I could sense its awareness of us, an intelligence beyond a simple predator's instincts. In the recesses of my mind, I clung to the vow I made before setting foot here. I promised to find answers, or at the very least, confirm whether rescue was possible for any who disappeared. My chest tightened with dread at the realization that we too might soon join their ranks if we slipped too far into the unseen depths. The silhouettes of my companions shifted, forging onward, hearts pounding as one. The path bent sharply, descending toward a shadowy cleft in the mountainside. I could hardly see more than a yard ahead, the flashlight beams swallowed by swirling mist. My boots caught on ragged roots, nearly pitching me forward. Another flash of distant lightning lent me a moment of clarity, revealing the faint mouth of a cave opening a short way down the slope. My veins throbbed, an urgent intuition telling me we had come to the threshold of the puzzle. The recollection of those vanished signals, cut off mid-scream, chilled me. Was this the place? No. A trembling set in my limbs. But I moved closer, guided by the relentless pull of truth. The wind hissed past the outcropping, and in that hush, I tasted the acrid smell of stagnant air drifting from the cave entrance. My heart hammered in an unsteady beat, torn between the urge to retreat and the desperate need to find a final answer. Overhead, the moon continued its vigil, casting elongated shadows that seemed almost sentient. The next step I took felt like a plunge off a cliff in its own way, a choice that might determine whether we ever returned. Yet, as the darkness of the cave yawned wider, I steadied my breath, letting my racing thoughts quiet. My only hope was that we hadn't already awakened something deeper and infinitely more terrifying than any rumor indicated. And so, with a final look over my shoulder at the swirling night, I gripped my camera once more, exhaled a shaky breath, and stepped into the unknown. The cave swallowed us whole as we crossed its threshold, the walls closing in with an oppressive weight that made each breath feel labored. The stench of rot grew stronger, curling through the narrow entrance and coating the back of my throat with something sour and metallic. The beam of my flashlight jittered as I tried to steady my hands, illuminating craggy stone walls glistening with condensation. Every step brought with it the soft scrape of gravel underfoot, the sound eerily amplified in the confined space. The air felt alive, almost electric, and each subtle shift in the temperature prickled against my skin. I could hear the faint drip of water from somewhere deep within, each plunk against stone resonating like the beat of a funeral march. My companions moved behind me in silence, the quiet almost reverent, as if we were intruding on a place that hadn't welcomed human footsteps for centuries. My camera swung at my side, the red recording light a small comfort in the suffocating dark. The path sloped downward, narrow and uneven. Shadows flickered and danced in the weak glow of our flashlights, creating the illusion of movement where none should have been. My nerves hummed with tension as I tried to convince myself that the faint shapes brushing the corners of my vision were tricks of the light. Yet a persistent dread tugged at the back of my mind, whispering that we were being watched. The smell changed as we descended, deepening into something thicker, almost like wet soil left to decay in a forgotten cellar. I ran my hand against the stone wall to steady myself. The surface cold and slick. Beneath the slimy texture, I felt grooves, long, deliberate scratches carved into the rock. They followed no discernible pattern, just erratic, jagged lines that crisscrossed like a chaotic map. My pulse quickened as my fingers traced a particularly deep gash, the edges sharp enough to suggest incredible force. From behind me, one of my companions muttered something under their breath, their voice trembling. I didn't ask them to repeat it. The air felt heavy with unspoken fears. Each of us too paralyzed to shatter the fragile quiet with words. My legs ached as the descent grew steeper, and the uneven terrain forced us to shuffle cautiously to avoid slipping. The flashlight beams dimmed slightly, the batteries straining under the weight of our extended exploration. Shadows pressed in closer, and the light seemed to be swallowed by the void just ahead. Faint sound broke the silence. Soft, rhythmic and wet, like something dragging itself across the damp stone floor. I froze, holding my breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The sound stopped, replaced by an unsettling quiet that pressed against my ears. I gestured for the others to halt, straining to pinpoint where the noise had come from. The tunnel ahead yawned wide, its jagged edges fading into black. A shiver ran down my spine as the sound returned, louder this time, and unmistakably closer. I aimed my flashlight toward the source, the beam trembling as it illuminated the jagged floor. For a moment, there was nothing, just empty stone glistening with moisture. Then, movement. A shape darted out of the lights, reach too fast to fully process. My gut twisted as I caught a glimpse of something slick and pale, a smear of motion that vanished before I could focus. I stepped back instinctively, nearly colliding with one of my companions. They hissed a warning, their own flashlight sweeping the area where the shape had disappeared. The beam revealed only the same empty stretch of tunnel, but my skin crawled with the certainty that we weren't alone. A low, guttural sound echoed faintly from deeper within the cave, a noise that was neither human nor animal. My breath hitched as the realization struck. Whatever was down here, it wasn't running from us. It was waiting. The walls around us seemed to shift, the grooves catching the light in new and unsettling ways. They no longer felt random. The scratches began to form patterns, crude but deliberate, spiraling inward like a vortex carved into the rock itself. My flashlight traced one such spiral, the lines growing deeper and more jagged as they converged on a central point. At the center was a handprint. It was enormous, far too large to belong to any person, and its edges were lined with jagged grooves that reminded me of claws. My stomach churned as I stepped back, bumping into the wall behind me. The air was growing colder, each breath fogging in front of my face, despite the humidity. My companions and I shared a glance. The terror in their eyes mirroring my own. The low sound from the depths of the cave grew louder, accompanied now by a faint vibration beneath our feet. It was rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the cave itself was alive, breathing, watching, waiting. The tunnel widened into a cavern, the space opening up so suddenly that it left me momentarily disoriented. My flashlight swept across the vast chamber, the beam catching flashes of stalactites hanging from the ceiling like jagged teeth. The floor was uneven, scattered with debris, bones, I realized with a jolt. Some were animal, but others were disturbingly human in shape. My chest tightened as I scanned the remains, noting the deep grooves that marred many of the larger bones. Teeth, marks, line base. At the center of the cavern was a pool of liquid, so black it seemed to drink the light. Its surface was perfectly still, reflecting nothing but the jagged ceiling above. The air around it felt heavier, and I had to fight the urge to gag as the stench of decay grew almost unbearable. Something about the pool drew my attention in a way that felt wrong, like my mind was being tugged toward it against my will. I took a hesitant step closer, my boots crunching on the gravel-strewn floor. The vibration in the ground grew stronger as I approached, the low hum now accompanied by a faint whispering that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was insistent, almost pleading. My flashlight flickered as I reached the edge of the pool, and for a moment I thought I saw movement beneath the surface. I froze, staring into the inky depths, my breath caught in my throat. The water, or whatever it was, began to ripple, the surface breaking apart in slow, deliberate waves. Something was rising. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet remained rooted to the spot as the ripples grew more violent. Pale, slick shape broke the surface, and my flashlight flickered again, casting the cavern into darkness for the briefest of moments. When the light returned, the shape was gone, and the surface of the pool was still once more. A deep guttural sound echoed through the cavern, louder now, and closer than before. My legs finally obeyed me, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the scattered bones. My companions called out. Their voices panicked, but the sound of their words was drowned out by the growing roar of whatever was emerging from the depths. The vibration beneath my feet became a tremor, and cracks began to spiderweb across the cavern floor. The pool erupted. Something enormous and impossibly fast shot upward, a mass of writhing limbs and gleaming flesh that defied comprehension. My flashlight shattered against the ground as I fell, plunging me into near total darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the pool, illuminating the monstrous shape that loomed above us. My heart raced as I scrambled backward, the sound of wet, heavy footsteps filling the air. The cave was alive with noise, roars, whispers, and the pounding of my own pulse. My companions were screaming, their voices blending into the chaos as the thing lunged forward. I didn't dare look back as I ran, the shadows swallowing us whole once more. The only thought in my mind was escape, though deep down, I feared it was already too late. The moment we started running, the air shifted. It wasn't just the sound of something massive chasing us. It was the suffocating pressure in the cavern itself, as if the walls and ceiling were breathing with us, anticipating our every move. My boots slipped on the wet stone, sending me careening against the jagged wall. Pain shot through my arm, but I didn't stop. None of us did. There was no room for hesitation, no time to comprehend the monstrous thing rising from the pool. The echoes of our frantic footsteps overlapped with an unsettling wet thud. Its pursuit, each step it took reverberated through the ground, shaking loose pebbles and sending tremors through my legs. My lungs burned as I pushed myself forward, dodging stalagmites that seemed to claw at the dim light. Behind me, the cavern filled with sounds that defied reason. A guttural growl so low it felt like it vibrated in my chest, overlaid with shrill, almost insect-like clicking. It was hunting us, and it was fast. The tunnel ahead began to narrow, the once vast chamber funneling into an uneven corridor. The thought of being trapped crossed my mind, but I clung to the hope that the narrow path might slow whatever was chasing us. My flashlight was gone, shattered in the chaos, so I relied on the weak beams from my companion's lights. They wavered, bouncing wildly off the walls. As we stumbled forward, my breathing was loud in my ears, but not loud enough to drown out the sound of stone cracking behind us. Whatever it was too large for this space. I glanced back, regretting it instantly. The creature's silhouette loomed in the dim light, its bulk forcing its way into the tunnel. It moved unnaturally, parts of its slick body folding and twisting in ways that made my stomach lurch. One massive limb slammed into the rock, and the cavern quaked. Dust and small fragments rained down, filling the air with a choking haze. Ahead of me, the path forked. I didn't have time to think, so I followed the left branch, trusting instinct over logic. The others were close behind, their panic palpable. The tunnel sloped downward, and I could feel the temperature dropping with every step. The air grew colder and wetter, clinging to my skin like icy fingers. My legs ached from the uneven terrain, but the pounding behind us never ceased. We turned a sharp corner, and the narrow passage abruptly opened into another chamber, smaller than the first, but no less foreboding. The walls were coated in a glistening substance that shimmered faintly in the dim light, like oil on water. My companion's flashlight caught movement near the ceiling, and I froze. I froze. There, tangled among the stalactites, were shapes. At first, I thought they were part of the rock formations, smooth, curved figures blending into the cavern. Then one of them moved, and my stomach dropped. They weren't rocks. They were cocoons. Dozens of them hung suspended from the ceiling, swaying gently despite the still air. Some were small, roughly the size of a child, while others were grotesquely oversized, their bloated forms pulsating faintly. The material encasing them looked organic, a translucent membrane stretched tight over shifting shapes inside. I could see something moving in one of the larger ones. Something struggling. I barely had time to process the horror before a wet, tearing sound echoed from behind us. The creature was closing in, its massive form too large to fit comfortably in the tunnel, but still forcing its way through. I could see its limbs scraping against the walls, the jagged stone tearing into its flesh, but not slowing it down. "Go!" someone shouted, their voice cracking with terror. I didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted toward the far end of the chamber, where another tunnel beckoned like the mouth of an escape route. The ground was slick beneath my feet, coated in the same viscous substance that clung to the walls. I slipped, catching myself just in time to avoid falling face first into the muck. As I scrambled forward, a sound stopped me cold. A faint, muffled cry. It was coming from one of the cocoons. Against every instinct screaming at me to keep running, I hesitated. My flashlight beam caught the source. A smaller cocoon near the ground, its membrane thinner than the others. Inside, I could see the outline of a face, pale and gaunt, eyes wide with terror. They were alive. I turned to my companions, shouting hoarsely for help. One of them grabbed my arm, their eyes wild. "We can't. There's no time," they hissed. But I couldn't leave. My fingers fumbled for anything sharp. Finally, finding a jagged piece of stone, I hacked at the cocoon, the material giving way with a sickening tear. A rancid smell hit me, nearly making me retch, but I didn't stop. The figure inside spilled out, gasping and coughing. It was a man, his skin slick with the same viscous substance that coated the walls. His eyes darted around wildly, and his lips moved. Though no sound came out, he looked emaciated, his body trembling violently. I hauled him to his feet, ignoring the weight of his frail form dragging on my arm. Behind us, the creature roared, a deafening sound that shook the chamber. It had breached the tunnel and was bearing down on us. Its form was clearer now, illuminated by the frantic beams of our flashlights. It was massive, its skin a sickly translucent gray that stretched over sinewy muscle. Its head was grotesque, with too many eyes, each one glowing faintly like embers. Its maw opened wide, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth that glistened with slime. I pulled the man forward, shouting at the others to run. The creature lunged, one massive limb slamming into the ground just behind us. The impact sent shockwaves through the chamber, knocking me off balance. I hit the ground hard, my ears ringing, dazed. I looked up to see the creature rearing back, its many eyes locking onto me. A hand grabbed my arm, yanking me to my feet. It was one of my companions, their face pale and streaked with dirt. Together, we stumbled toward the tunnel, dragging the man between us. The creature roared again, its voice A cacophony of guttural snarls and shrill clicks. It gave chase, its massive form scraping against the walls as it barreled forward. The tunnel was tighter now, the walls pressing in as we fled. The air grew colder, each breath burning in my lungs. My legs screamed in protest, but I forced them to keep moving. The man we had freed stumbled, nearly collapsing, but we pulled him along. The tunnel twisted and turned, and I prayed we weren't running deeper into a trap. The creature's roars echoed behind us, growing fainter with each step. It was too large to follow us through the narrow passage, but I knew it wouldn't give up. The sound of its rage reverberated through the stone, a promise that this was far from over. As the tunnel began to slope upward, a faint light appeared ahead. It wasn't natural light, too cold and pale, but it was enough to guide us forward. My chest heaved as I ran, the weight of the man slowing me down. But I didn't care. All that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between us and the nightmare behind. The passage opened into another chamber, smaller and less ominous than the last. The air here was still cold, but the oppressive weight was lessened. I collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath, my entire body trembling. My companions did the same, their faces pale and hollow. The man we had saved sat slumped against the wall, his chest heaving. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and terror. His lips moved again, and this time I could just barely make out the words, "It's not over." The weight of his warning settled over me like a shroud. I knew he was right. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The man's words lingered in the frigid air, his whisper, "It's not over," cutting through the faint light that bathed the chamber. My chest tightened, the weight of his warning clawing at my already fraying nerves. I glanced around, searching for any sign of safety, but the faint light only highlighted how trapped we still were. The walls here were smooth, unnervingly so, as if shaped by something other than nature. The faint patterns etched into the surface looked almost intentional, spiraling toward a central point at the far end of the room. The man we'd rescued collapsed further against the wall, his frail body trembling as he struggled to breathe. His skin was pallid and damp, the same translucent sheen that coated the walls, now clinging to him like a second layer of flesh. He didn't look at me, his wide eyes instead fixed on the faintly glowing markings that spread across the walls like veins. His lips moved again, too quiet to hear, but his trembling hands gestured weakly toward the far end of the chamber. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. My flashlight beam cut through the dimness, landing on what first appeared to be a jagged column jutting from the ground. But as I moved closer, I realized it wasn't stone at all. It was organic, a gnarled mass of sinew and bone, twisted into an unnatural spire. My stomach churned as the light caught details I wished I hadn't seen. Fingers, or perhaps claws, fused into the grotesque structure, their jagged tips stretching toward the ceiling as if frozen mid-reach. The others gathered behind me, their silence louder than any scream. I could feel their unease radiating like static electricity, thickening the air. One of them whispered my name, their voice barely audible, and I tore my gaze away from the spire. The man on the floor convulsed suddenly, his body racked with violent shudders. I dropped to my knees beside him, panic rising as his eyes rolled back and his breathing became shallow. His mouth opened, but instead of words, a sound emerged, a low, guttural noise that didn't belong to a human throat. It echoed in the chamber, reverberating off the walls and triggering a strange vibration in the ground beneath us. The patterns on the walls began to pulse faintly, the veins of light growing brighter and dimmer in an unnatural rhythm. My hands hovered over him, useless against whatever was happening. The sound grew louder, a bone-deep resonance that made my teeth ache. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The man fell still, his chest barely rising as he gasped for air. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment they locked onto mine with startling clarity. He raised a trembling hand, pointing toward the spire. His voice, hoarse and broken, rasped out a single word: destroy. The command hung in the air, and I hesitated, my mind reeling. Destroy it? How? Wounds? How? Me del and das? And what would that even do? Exil. Liven pie. My companions exchanged uneasy glances, but before anyone could speak, the vibration returned. This time, it wasn't just the walls. The ground itself began to tremble, a rhythmic pulse that grew stronger with each passing second. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the distant sound of cracking stone sent my heart racing. Whatever we had disturbed, it was waking up. The man's eyes rolled back again, and he slumped to the side, unconscious. I shook him, desperate for more answers, but he didn't respond. The others shouted over the growing rumble, their words frantic and scattered. We needed to move, but there was nowhere to go. The tunnel we'd come through was now vibrating so intensely that chunks of stone began to fall, blocking the way back. I turned back to the spire, its grotesque surface shimmering in the pulsating light. It seemed to be the source of the vibration, the center of whatever was happening. Evident. My mind raced, and I grabbed a jagged piece of stone from the ground, the same one I'd used to cut the man free. My companions shouted behind me, but I ignored them, stepping closer to the spire. The air around it was thick and heavy, each breath feeling like I was inhaling liquid. My heart pounded as I raised the stone, aiming for the nearest protrusion. Something that looked like a skeletal hand fused into the spire's surface. The vibration intensified as I hesitated, my grip tightening on the makeshift weapon. Then, with all the force I could muster, I brought it down. The impact sent a shock wave through the chamber, the vibration surging to a deafening crescendo. The spire cracked where I'd struck it, a black, tar-like substance oozing from the wound. It smelled acrid, burning my nostrils and making my eyes water. I struck again, and this time a scream filled the air. Not from me, not from my companions, but from the spire itself. The sound was unearthly, a high-pitched wail that felt alive, as if the spire was reacting to the damage. The light on the walls pulsed erratically now, the patterns shifting and writhing like living things. My companions backed away, their faces pale with terror, but I couldn't stop. I swung the stone again and again, each strike sending more of the black substance splattering onto the ground. The wail grew louder, piercing through my skull and making my vision blur. Suddenly, the spire split apart with a deafening crack, the tar-like substance erupting in all directions. I stumbled back, shielding my face as the chamber was bathed in an unnatural glow. The patterns on the walls flared bright white, then began to fade, the light dimming until it vanished entirely. The vibration ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that felt heavier than the noise. For a moment, I thought it was over. I turned to my companions, their wide eyes staring at the now ruined spire. But the silence didn't last. And was you did any, but there's silence. A low rumble began to build, not from the spire, but from the ground beneath us. Cracks spider-webbed across the floor, and the walls groaned under the pressure. The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting as frost began to form on the stone. Then I felt it. A presence. It wasn't the spire or the creature we had fled from earlier. Eerie, shivers, This was different, deeper, and far more ancient. It pressed against my mind, not with words, but with a sensation, a suffocating weight that made it hard to think. The ground beneath the ruined spire began to split open, revealing a dark void that seemed to stretch endlessly downward. From that void, a faint, glowing light began to rise. I stumbled back, dragging the unconscious man with me as the light grew brighter. My companions shouted, their voices indistinct over the growing noise. The light took form, coalescing into something that defied description. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't intangible either. A shifting mass of light and shadow that pulsed with a rhythm like a heartbeat. It didn't move, but I could feel its awareness, its attention fixed on us. My chest tightened as the weight of its gaze pressed down on me. It wasn't just looking, it was examining, peeling back the layers of my mind and seeing everything I was. Every fear, every doubt, every regret. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The light grew brighter, its pulse quickening, and I realized it wasn't just observing us. It was deciding. The ground beneath my feet shifted, and I snapped out of my daze. I grabbed the unconscious man and shouted at the others to move, to run, but they were frozen, their faces locked in expressions of terror. The glowing mass began to rise, and with it came a sound, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through my bones. It wasn't just a noise, it was a warning. I pulled at my companions, my voice hoarse as I begged them to move. Slowly, they began to respond, their bodies shaking off the paralysis. We stumbled toward the far end of the chamber, away from the glowing mass. that now dominated the space. The tunnel ahead was narrow and dark, but it was our only option. As we fled, the light behind us grew brighter, and the hum became a roar. The chamber began to collapse, the walls crumbling inward as the glowing mass expanded. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My only focus was on the path ahead, on keeping my legs moving despite the overwhelming weight of fear pressing down on me. The last thing I heard before the tunnel swallowed us was the sound of the chamber imploding, the roar of destruction chasing us into the darkness. The darkness in the tunnel seemed thicker, almost alive. As we fled deeper into the unknown, my lungs burned, every breath ragged and shallow. The roar of the collapsing chamber behind us was deafening, a cacophony of crumbling stone and the terrifying hum of that glowing mass. Dust and debris filled the air, and I could feel the grit grinding against my teeth as I struggled to breathe. My fingers clutched the unconscious man's arm, dragging him forward as best I could, though my legs felt like lead. Ahead of me, the faint beams of my companion's flashlights swayed erratically, casting long, jittering shadows on the tunnel walls. Every now and then, one of them would falter, a stumble, or a panicked glance back. I didn't dare look behind me. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and I knew without seeing that whatever we'd unleashed wasn't gone. It was following us. You so really netted new house sooner harder. It was following us, not with the same lumbering presence as the creature before, but something quieter, more deliberate. It was in the silence between breaths, the tremor in the ground beneath my feet. The tunnel sloped downward again, the incline so steep I nearly lost my footing. I tightened my grip on the man, his weight dragging against me like an anchor. My mind raced with fragmented thoughts, trying to piece together what had just happened. The spire, the glowing mass, the way it had looked at me, not with eyes, but with something deeper, more invasive. My skin still crawled from the memory of its presence, the sensation of being peeled open, laid bare. The tunnel finally leveled out, spilling us into a smaller chamber. I stumbled, falling to my knees as I gasped for air. The others collapsed around me, their faces pale and streaked with dirt. The man we'd rescued lay motionless beside me, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Every small noise amplified in the absence of the chaos we'd left behind. My pulse pounded in my ears, a reminder of how close we'd come to being buried alive. I forced myself to my feet, my legs trembling as I shone my flashlight around the chamber. It was smaller than the others, the walls close enough that I felt hemmed in, trapped. The ground was littered with debris, broken rocks, fragments of bone, and a thick, tar-like substance that oozed from cracks in the stone. The air smelled acrid, each breath searing my throat. My companions were huddled together, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. No one spoke. We all knew there was no comfort to be found in words. The man stirred, a faint groan escaping his lips. I dropped to my knees beside him, shaking his shoulder gently. His eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. But there was a spark of awareness there. He mumbled something, his voice too weak to carry, and I leaned closer, straining to hear. His lips move again, forming a single word that sent a chill down my spine. Deeper. I recoiled, my stomach twisting. Deeper. Deeper. The thought of descending any further into this nightmare made my skin crawl. But his eyes locked onto mine, pleading. He reached out, his fingers brushing against my arm with surprising strength. "It's the only way," he rasped, his voice barely audible, but laced with a conviction that rooted me to the spot. I glanced at my companions, their faces mirroring the same horror that churned in my gut. No one wanted to go deeper, but what choice did we have? The way back was gone, and whatever was following us wouldn't stop. I could feel its presence lingering in the tunnel behind us. A cold, creeping dread that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The air seemed to vibrate faintly, the same rhythmic pulse from before, growing stronger with each passing moment. We moved cautiously, every step a struggle against the weight of exhaustion and fear. The tunnel beyond the chamber was narrow and uneven, forcing us to stoop as we pressed forward. My flashlight flickered, the weak beam barely illuminating the path ahead. The walls were different here, smoother and colder, and the faint patterns that had marked the earlier chambers were gone. Instead, the stone seemed to glisten with an unnatural sheen, as if it had been polished by countless years of something flowing over it. The air grew colder, biting against my skin. My breath fogged in front of me, the white puffs quickly swallowed by the darkness. The man leaned heavily against me as we walked, his steps unsteady but determined. His murmurs were constant now, low and fragmented, like a prayer or a chant. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unsettling, almost reverent. I didn't have the strength to ask him to stop. The tunnel opened into another chamber, this one vast and cavernous. My flashlight barely reached the far walls, the beam swallowed by the void. The floor sloped downward into the center of the room, where a massive pit yawned open. My stomach churned at the sight of it, a black void that seemed to pulse faintly with the same rhythm I'd felt since we destroyed the spire. The edges of the pit were lined with jagged rocks, and a faint glowing mist rose from its depths, swirling lazily like smoke from a dying fire. The man pulled away from me, his movements surprisingly strong despite his frail appearance. He stumbled toward the edge of the pit, his eyes wide and transfixed. I reached out to stop him, but one of my companions grabbed my arm, shaking their head. "Let him," they whispered, their voice trembling. "He knows something we don't." We watched in silence as the man dropped to his knees at the edge of the pit, his hands clutching the ground as he leaned forward. His murmurs grew louder, the words still unintelligible, but filled with a desperate urgency. The mist from the pit curled around him, clinging to his skin like tendrils. I took a step forward, torn between the urge to pull him back and the fear of what might happen if I did. The ground beneath us trembled, a faint vibration that grew stronger with each passing second. The pit began to glow, the mist swirling faster as the light intensified. I shielded my eyes, the brightness searing against the darkness that had surrounded us for so long. The man's voice rose to a shout, his words finally breaking through the roar of the vibration. "It's awake." Before I could react, the light from the pit exploded outward, flooding the chamber with a blinding brilliance. I was thrown back, the force of the blast slamming me into the wall. Pain shot through my body, but it was drowned out by the overwhelming sensation of weightlessness, as if the ground beneath me had vanished. The light consumed everything, and for a brief moment, I felt as though I was suspended in a void, untethered from reality. When the light finally faded, I found myself sprawled on the cold, hard ground. The chamber was silent once more, the pit now dark and still. The man was gone. My companions lay scattered around me, dazed and disoriented, but alive. I pushed myself to my feet, my body trembling with the effort, and stared at the pit. It looked the same as before, but I knew something had changed. Whatever was down there, it wasn't sleeping anymore. The chamber was still, but it wasn't the stillness of peace. It was the kind of silence that sits heavy in the air, filling every crack and corner with unease. My knees trembled as I forced myself upright, my flashlight dangling uselessly in my hand. The pit at the center of the room no longer glowed, but the faint pulse that had haunted us since the spire's destruction remained, weaker now, but persistent. I could feel it in the soles of my feet, a rhythmic vibration that set my nerves alight. The man we'd rescued was gone, vanished into the void, as if he'd never existed. I stared at the spot where he'd knelt, the faint imprint of his hands still visible in the dust near the pit's edge. My companions gathered behind me, their breaths shallow and uneven. None of us spoke. We didn't need to. The air itself seemed to warn against breaking the fragile quiet. I tore my gaze from the pit and scanned the chamber, my flashlight's beam cutting through the lingering mist. The walls were smooth, unnaturally so, and I realized with a jolt that the intricate patterns that had adorned the stone earlier were gone. It was as if the chamber had been wiped clean, leaving only the oppressive blankness of polished rock. The sight made my skin crawl. Doom and the doted sight made my skin crawl. One of my companions stumbled forward, their voice breaking the silence. "We need to leave," they rasped, their words brittle and raw. I nodded, unable to summon the strength for a reply. My legs felt leaden as I turned toward the nearest tunnel, the same one we'd used to enter. It was still intact, but the air within it seemed thicker, darker, as though something was waiting just beyond the reach of my light. The first step into the tunnel was the hardest. The ground beneath me felt unsteady, as though it might give way at any moment. The pulse grew stronger as we moved, each beat reverberating through the stone and into my bones. My companions followed in silence, their footfalls muted against the unnerving rhythm. The flashlight beams danced erratically, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to move on their own. How? The tunnel twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the unknown. My sense of direction was long gone, replaced by the gnawing certainty that we were lost. And the air grew colder with each step, the frost forming on the walls, now spreading to the floor. My boots slipped on the icy surface, and I nearly fell, catching myself against the wall. The stone burned against my palm, the cold so intense it felt like fire. Ahead of me, the tunnel opened into another chamber, smaller and more confined than the last. The walls here were jagged, covered in crystalline formations that shimmered faintly in the light. The pulse was stronger now, its rhythm aligning with the faint glow of the crystals. I approached one of them cautiously, my flashlight reflecting off its surface. Within the crystal, something moved. I stumbled back, my heart lurching in my chest. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A shadowy shape writhed within the crystal, its edges blurred and indistinct. I reached out, my fingers hovering just above the surface, and the pulse quickened. The shadow shifted, drawn toward my hand as though it could sense me. A cold dread settled in my stomach, and I pulled back, retreating to the center of the chamber. Everywhere, the others were frozen, their gazes locked on the crystals that lined the walls. Each one held a similar shadow, twisting and writhing in time with the pulse. The realization hit me like a blow. These weren't just stones. They were prisons. One of my companions spoke, their voice trembling. What are they? I shook my head, unable to answer. The truth was, I didn't want to know. We didn't want to know. Whatever these things were, they were meant to be freed. The air grew heavier, pressing down on us, as if the chamber itself disapproved of our presence. My chest tightened, and I struggled to breathe. A low rumble broke the silence, the sound vibrating through the chamber and rattling the crystals on the walls. The shadows within them grew more frantic, their movements erratic and violent. The pulse quickened, each beat hammering against my skull. Suborlind sighed. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam jerking wildly as I searched for an exit. The tunnel we'd come through was gone, replaced by a solid wall of stone. Panic surged through me, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The walls of the chamber seemed to close in, the crystals glowing brighter with each passing second. The shadows within them stretched and twisted, their forms pressing against the translucent surfaces as if trying to break free. The rumble grew louder, and the ground beneath us began to shake. I dropped to my knees, my hands pressed against the cold stone for balance. The pulse was deafening now, a relentless drumbeat that drowned out every other sound. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I saw the shadows within the crystals turn their attention toward us. Their movements became purposeful, their shapes coalescing into something almost recognizable. A crack echoed through the chamber, sharp and piercing. One of the crystals split down the center, a jagged line that spread like a spiderweb. The shadow within surged forward, pressing against the fracture with desperate force. I scrambled back, my heart pounding. As the crack widened, the crystal shattered, and the shadow spilled out, a formless mass of darkness that moved with unsettling fluidity. It didn't hesitate. The shadow surged toward us, its movements unnaturally fast and chaotic. I threw myself to the side, barely avoiding its grasp. The air around it was freezing, each breath burning my lungs as I struggled to regain my footing. My companions weren't as lucky. One of them screamed as the shadow enveloped them, their voice cutting off abruptly as the darkness consumed them. The chamber was chaos. The remaining crystals began to crack, the shadows within them thrashing violently. I didn't wait to see what would happen. Grabbing the closest flashlight, I turned toward the far end of the chamber, where a faint glimmer of light caught my eye. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. I ran. The ground buckled beneath me as I sprinted toward the light, the roar of shattering crystals and the screams of my companions filling the air. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The faint light grew brighter, and I threw myself toward it, desperation fueling my every step. I burst into a narrow tunnel, the walls jagged and uneven. The pulse was weaker here, the oppressive weight of the chamber giving way to a faint sense of relief. I didn't stop running, my legs carrying me forward on pure instinct. The light ahead grew brighter, and for the first time, I felt a sliver of hope. The tunnel opened into another chamber, this one smaller and less menacing. The walls were bare, free of crystals or patterns, and the air was still. I collapsed to the ground, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. My flashlight flickered, its beam weak and unsteady, but it was enough to reveal that I was alone. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint echo of the pulse, now distant and fading. I stared at the tunnel behind me, half expecting the shadows to pour through, but nothing came. My body trembled, the adrenaline fading and leaving me cold and hollow. I didn't know where I was or what lay ahead, but one thing was clear. There was no going back. The silence wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket, heavy and oppressive. My breathing felt shallow, the cold air of the cavern making each inhale sharp and biting. The faint beam of my flashlight struggled against the encroaching darkness, casting jittery shadows that seemed almost alive. My legs ached, my body trembling as I tried to steady myself on the uneven ground. The pit at the center of the vast chamber loomed in my mind. Even though it was now out of sight, its stillness had been deceptive, its presence commanding and ominous. I couldn't shake the feeling that the entire space was alive, as though the walls themselves had been observing me, waiting for something I didn't yet understand. I stood in a narrow tunnel now, the walls pressing close enough that I could feel the cold seeping into my skin. The way forward was unclear, but there was no turning back. The collapsing chamber behind me had made sure of that. My companions were gone, lost to the chaos, or separated by the shifting, treacherous ground. I didn't have the strength to call out for them. A part of me feared what might answer if I did. The tunnel began to slope downward, its descent gradual but relentless. The air grew colder with each step, the frost clinging to the walls, spreading to the floor. My flashlight flickered, its weak beam illuminating the narrow path ahead in faint bursts. I tightened my grip on it, as though holding onto the light could somehow anchor me to reality. The ground beneath me shifted subtly, the faint vibrations I'd felt before growing stronger. It was rhythmic, like a heartbeat, and I couldn't escape the sensation that the entire place was breathing, alive in ways that defied explanation. My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of what I'd seen and experienced. The strange formations, the glowing light, the unnatural presence. It all felt connected, but the picture remained incomplete. The tunnel opened into another chamber, smaller than the last, but no less unsettling. The walls here were lined with jagged formations that glittered faintly in the dim light. They reminded me of crystals, their surfaces smooth and reflective. But there was something wrong about them. They seemed to hum faintly, vibrating in harmony with the pulse beneath my feet. I stepped closer to one of the formations, my flashlight casting a flickering glow across its surface. Within the crystalline structure, shadows twisted and writhed, their movements fluid and hypnotic. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shadows weren't reflections. They were inside, moving with a purpose that sent a chill down my spine. I stumbled back, the beam of my flashlight skittering across the chamber. Each crystal held a similar shadow, their forms shifting and stretching as though aware of my presence. The pulse grew louder, the rhythm quickening, and the ground beneath me trembled. My instinct screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The tunnel behind me had disappeared, replaced by a solid wall of stone. The air grew thicker, each breath a struggle. The shadows within the crystals grew more frantic, their movements erratic and violent. The hum became a roar, the vibrations shaking the walls and sending shards of crystal clattering to the ground. I covered my ears, the noise reverberating through my skull, but it did little to muffle the sound. The largest crystal shattered with a deafening crack, and the shadow within spilled out, a swirling mass of darkness that moved with unnatural speed. It flowed across the ground, its movements chaotic yet purposeful. I scrambled backward, my flashlight beam flickering wildly as I tried to keep the thing in my sight. The air around it grew colder, a biting chill that made my lungs ache. The shadow surged toward me, and I threw myself to the side, narrowly avoiding its grasp. The ground beneath me heaved, sending me sprawling. Emuduta, Sirs, for a day. My flashlight clattered to the ground, its beam casting jagged patterns across the walls as it rolled. The shadow loomed over me, its presence overwhelming. But just as it lunged, a crack split the chamber. The roar of breaking stone filled the air, and the ground gave way beneath me. I fell, the cold air rushing past me as the world blurred into a swirling mass of shadow and light. My body hit something solid, the impact jarring but not fatal. I lay there for a moment, gasping for air, the pulse now a distant thrum beneath me. When I opened my eyes, I found myself in a narrow passageway, the walls smooth and featureless. The oppressive presence of the chamber above was gone, replaced by a cold emptiness that felt almost worse. My flashlight lay a few feet away, its beam flickering weakly. I crawled toward it, my hands shaking. As I grasped the handle, the light revealed a path ahead, winding and uneven. I didn't know where it led, but I had no other choice. Use endel kritika. I forced myself to my feet, my body protesting with every movement, and began to walk. The pulse was faint now, a distant memory that lingered in the back of my mind. But I knew better than to think it was over. The path twisted and turned, the walls narrowing and widening unpredictably. The air grew colder with each step, the frost creeping along the walls and floor. My breath fogged in front of me, the faint mist swirling in patterns that felt too deliberate to be random. I kept moving, driven by the faint hope that somewhere ahead lay an exit, a way out of this nightmare. The tunnel eventually opened into a smaller chamber, one devoid of the grotesque formations and crystalline prisons I'd seen before. The walls were bare, smooth and cold, and the air was eerily still. I collapsed to the ground, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The flashlight flickered one last time before going dark, leaving me alone in the pitch-black silence. I don't know how long I sat there, my thoughts a swirling mess of fear and confusion. The pulse was gone, but its memory lingered, a phantom thrum that I couldn't shake. The silence pressed in around me, heavy and suffocating, but for the first time it felt like the silence of something receding, retreating back into the depth. I don't know if I escaped, or if the silence was just the calm before something worse. All I know is that the darkness isn't empty, it's alive, waiting, and it never truly lets go.